Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. The crisp October morning air in Westminster, Colorado carried the first whispers of autumn. It was Friday, October 5th, 2012. A day that should have been like any other for 10-year-old Jessica Ridgway. Children bundled in light jackets headed to school, their breath forming small clouds in the cool air. For Jessica, this morning should have been filled with fifth-grade lessons, time with friends, and the simple joys of childhood. Instead, it became the day that shattered a community and transformed a neighborhood into a landscape of fear and heartbreak. Jessica was a vibrant child who brought energy and laughter wherever she went. Purple was her signature color, a love so deep, it seemed to reflect something essential about who she was. Bold, bright, impossible to miss. She loved riding her scooter through neighborhood parks, wind rushing through her hair as she glided down pathways. She walked her dog with a gentleness that revealed her compassionate nature. She practiced cheerleading routines with friends, her enthusiasm infectious, her smile wide and genuine. To those who knew her, Jessica embodied the essence of childhood, curiosity, joy, and a trust in the world that assumed safety and kindness from others. That Friday morning, Jessica left her Westminster home on foot, heading to Witt Elementary School as she had countless times before. The route was familiar, the kind of short walk that parents in quiet suburban neighborhoods allow their children to make alone, a small step toward independence. Her mother, who worked overnight shifts and usually slept during morning hours, trusted her daughter would reach school safely as always. There was no reason to think this day would be any different from all the others. But Jessica never made it to school. Hours passed, and by afternoon, school officials contacted Jessica's mother with news that freezes every parent's heart. Jessica was marked absent. She hadn't walked through the school doors that morning. Her mother, suddenly and horrifyingly thrust into a nightmare she couldn't yet fully comprehend, immediately called the police. Within hours, what had begun as a beautiful autumn day became the start of every community's worst fear. The search for Jessica Ridgway began that afternoon and would continue for 17 agonizing days. Westminster police moved quickly, knowing that with missing children, time is everything. Every passing hour decreases the chances of finding them alive. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, going door to door with Jessica's photo, asking about any unusual sightings that morning. They collected DNA samples from residents, over 700 specimens, to rule out potential suspects and narrow their investigation. The community responded with a solidarity born of crisis. Countless volunteers formed search parties, combing through fields, parks, and wooded areas. Jessica's family faced news cameras, their faces marked by an anguish no parent should endure. They made emotional pleas for information, for anyone who might have seen their daughter, for their little girl's safe return. Her mother spoke of knowing immediately that something was wrong, that gut feeling that surpasses reason, operating on pure terror. The entire town seemed frozen in waiting, clinging to hope that Jessica would be found unharmed, that this story would end the way everyone desperately wished. On October 7th, just 2 days after Jessica vanished, a discovery gave investigators their first solid lead. Jessica's backpack was found in a residential area of Superior, Colorado, about 6 miles from her home. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation examined the backpack for DNA evidence, while police collected reference samples from Jessica's residence. The backpack's discovery, while providing crucial evidence, also deepened the public's dread. If Jessica's bag had been abandoned miles from where she disappeared, what did that mean for Jessica herself? The answer came 3 days later on October 10th in a discovery so horrifying it would haunt the community for years. Workers in Arvada, at Patridge Park near Highway 93, discovered human remains inside a trash bag. When investigators arrived and examined the discovery, they found something beyond comprehension. The body had been dismembered. For several days, officials worked to identify the remains, a task made harder by the body's condition. On October 12th, the Jefferson County coroner confirmed what everyone had feared, but prayed wasn't true. The remains belonged to Jessica Ridgway. The confirmation of Jessica's death sent shockwaves through Westminster and surrounding communities. In this peaceful suburban setting, where families raised their children and enjoyed a sense of security, such violence seemed impossible. The nature of the crime, the dismemberment of a child, pointed to a perpetrator of exceptional cruelty and depravity. Parents who had previously allowed their kids to walk to school now drove them. Trust in the neighborhood's safety was shattered. Schools implemented heightened security measures. The population lived under a cloud of collective grief and fear, knowing that someone capable of such acts remained at large, unidentified, and unpredictable. On October 10th, law enforcement made a point of publicly clearing Jessica's parents from suspicion, emphasizing their belief that she had been abducted by an unknown individual. The FBI released a behavioral profile of the suspect, hoping for public recognition of characteristics or behaviors that might identify the perpetrator. Detectives worked tirelessly, pursuing leads, analyzing evidence, and building what they hoped would be a solid case to bring Jessica's killer to justice. Then, on October 19th, a crucial tip came into the police hotline that would change everything. A neighborhood resident reported information about a 17-year-old local resident named Austin Reed Sigg. The caller noted that Sigg wore a cross necklace similar to one authorities believed the killer had worn. More alarmingly, the neighbor mentioned Sigg's unusual preoccupation with death. 2 FBI agents were dispatched to collect a DNA sample from Sigg, who lived in Westminster, near where Jessica had been taken. What happened next was perhaps the most unexpected development in the entire investigation. On the night of October 23, 2012, the Westminster Police Department received a call that defied all expectations. On the other end was a woman's voice, trembling with emotion, speaking words that would later be presented in court. "My son wants to turn himself in for the murder of Jessica Ridgway." The caller was Mindy Sigg, Austin's mother, and she was on the verge of a decision that would devastate her own life while potentially protecting others. In the recorded conversation that followed, a young male voice joined in, calm and disturbingly composed. "I murdered Jessica Ridgway," Austin Sigg stated. "I have proof that I did it. I'm giving myself up completely. There will be no resistance whatsoever." Police immediately went to the Sigg residence in Westminster and arrested this 17-year-old without incident. When officers searched his home, they discovered evidence supporting his confession, including parts of Jessica's remains that Sigg had kept in his house's crawl space. As detectives interviewed Sigg and pieced together the facts, the full horror of Jessica's fate emerged. In a recorded police interview, Sigg described how he had driven around on the morning of October 5th, looking for a victim. He claimed that Jessica wasn't selected deliberately. She simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was random. Random location, random time. Random everything, he said with chilling indifference. He had waited as Jessica walked past on her way to school. As she approached his vehicle, he grabbed her, restraining her with zip ties and rope around her wrists and ankles. He drove her back to his empty house. What Sigg did to Jessica during those hours is almost too painful to describe. He assaulted the 10-year-old girl before strangling her to death. But his crimes didn't end with murder. In an act of unspeakable brutality, Sigg dismembered Jessica's body. He kept portions of her remains in his home's crawl space and disposed of her torso in a trash bag left at Patridge Park, where it would be discovered days later. The investigation further revealed that this wasn't Sigg's first violent act. On May 28, 2012, months before Jessica's murder, Sig had attempted to kidnap a 22-year-old female jogger near Kettner Lake, grabbing her from behind as she ran on a trail. She managed to break free and escape. This case had remained unsolved until Sig confessed to it as well. As the community grappled with the arrest and shocking revelations about him, attention turned to Austin Sig himself and the inevitable questions. Who was this teenager? And how could he become someone capable of such horrific acts? He had previously attended a local high school but had withdrawn during his junior year to pursue his GED. At the time of his capture, he was enrolled at a community college, studying mortuary science. According to records later revealed by his mother, he had experienced bullying over his voice, though this was never discussed at the time. She described them as having been very close, making his hidden violent fantasies and criminal behavior even harder to fathom. She would later state in court that Austin's background wasn't a factor in his crimes, insisting he had not been abused during his childhood. She attended all court proceedings involving her son, often accompanied by family and friends, driven by a need to understand what happened and face the consequences of her son's action. In later interviews, she would emphasize that her parenting wasn't to blame, expressing bewilderment over how or why her son had committed such terrible crimes. On October 30th, 2012, Austin Sig was formally charged as an adult on 17 counts. 11 of these related to Jessica Ridgway's murder and included first-degree murder with premeditation, second-degree kidnapping, felony murder, and robbery. The other 6 counts connected to the attempted abduction on May 28th and involved charges of attempted first-degree murder, attempted assault, and attempted kidnapping. During their investigation, detectives had also uncovered materials related to child exploitation, resulting in additional charges of sexual exploitation of a minor. Despite Sig having no prior criminal record, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had confessed his guilt not only in a phone call, but also during extensive police interrogations. His DNA matched evidence collected from the crime scenes. Physical traces from Jessica were found in his home. The prosecution described their case as ironclad. Nevertheless, Sig initially entered a not guilty plea, and the legal process moved forward. Then, on October 1st, 2013, almost a year after Jessica's murder, Austin Sig took an action that shocked many in the courtroom. Against the advice of his lawyers, he stood before Jefferson County District Court Judge Stephen Munsinger and changed his plea to guilty. He publicly admitted his crimes and pleaded guilty to 15 charges total, including first-degree murder, assault on a child, kidnapping, attempted kidnapping, and exploitation of a minor. He also formally acknowledged responsibility for the May 28, 2012, attempted kidnapping of the female jogger. On November 19, 2013, Judge Munsinger sentenced Austin Sig. Because Sig was 17 when Jessica died, he couldn't receive the death penalty. Instead, Munsinger sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. But the judge went further. Recognizing the severity of Sig's actions and the need to ensure he would never pose a threat again, Munsinger ordered that Sig must serve an additional 86 years after becoming eligible for parole. Sig's defense team attempted to argue that the sentence was cruel and unusual, but Judge Munsinger rejected their arguments. "This case demands a life sentence," the judge declared, his words reflecting the sentiments of a community devastated by Sig's crimes. In June 2014, Sig was transferred to an undisclosed prison outside Colorado, a measure taken to protect his safety as well as the privacy and safety of the Ridgway family. He effectively disappeared from Colorado, relocated to serve his time far from the community he had so deeply wounded. For Westminster, healing was slow and painful. The community had been profoundly shaken by Jessica's murder. The random nature of the crime, that Jessica was simply a child walking to school like countless others did daily, made it even more frightening. Yet, amid the grief and fear, The community also demonstrated remarkable resilience and compassion. They rallied around Jessica's family with support, love, prayers, meals, and whatever else was needed to help them begin their journey toward healing. Working together with Jessica's family, friends, and the broader community, Westminster determined to create a lasting tribute to Jessica's memory. They designated a park near her home as Jessica Ridgway Memorial Park. The community worked together to make the park distinctive and reflective of the spirited child who had been lost. Jessica's beloved color purple was thoughtfully woven throughout the space. The park features playground equipment and landscaping that mirror the joy Jessica found in everyday activities, riding her scooter, walking her dog, playing with friends, practicing cheerleading moves. Funding for the park was raised by the Westminster Legacy Foundation, with numerous volunteers helping to build, install new features, and improve the grounds. On October 5th, 2013, exactly 1 year after Jessica disappeared, Jessica Ridgway Memorial Park was dedicated. It now stands as a permanent tribute to her vibrant spirit and as a peaceful place for healing. The park, located at 10,765 Moore Street in Westminster, serves two purposes. It's a place where children can play and families can gather, enjoying the kind of joyful activity and happiness that Jessica herself treasured. And it's also a place for remembrance and reflection. Every year, hundreds of children and adults visit the park, keeping Jessica's memory alive and ensuring her brief life continues to hold meaning and impact. The story of Jessica Ridgway is more than just an account of crime and justice. It speaks to the fragility of innocence, the randomness of violence, and the devastating choices made by certain people that ripple outward, affecting not just those they harm, but entire communities. It's equally a story of the heartbreaking moral dilemmas facing those close to perpetrators of terrible deeds, as seen in Mindy Sigg's painful decision to turn in her own child. In the end, it's a story of resilience, about communities that refuse to be defined by violence, choosing instead to remember and celebrate those lost, creating meaning and beauty from sorrow. Jessica Ridgway's life lasted just 10 years, but her impact on Westminster and everyone touched by her story extends far beyond that time. She's remembered not primarily as a victim, but as a vibrant, joyful girl who loved the color purple, riding scooters, dogs, and her friends. Her legacy lives on in a playground, echoing with the sounds of playing children, in a town that came together in the face of terror, and in the determination of countless families to protect their children, while still allowing them to experience the freedom and joy of childhood. The tragedy that befell Jessica can never be undone, but the response to that tragedy, the love, the memorials, the commitment to never forget, stands as testament to humanity's enduring capacity to seek out light even in the deepest darkness. Story 2. During the early 1980s, the Arizona desert represented a world of limitless possibility, a landscape of sun-scorched earth and endless blue skies, where fortunes could be built from grit and ambition. It was a place where conventional rules seemed to melt under the relentless sun, a haven for dreamers and builders, rebels and risk-takers. And at the heart of this scene, in the sprawling metropolis of Phoenix, a new king was rising. His name was Charles H. Keating Jr., a man who embodied the era's spirit, charismatic, bold, and fiercely ambitious. A financier poised to build an empire that would captivate the nation before collapsing spectacularly in a blaze of scandal and ruin. Keating didn't come from the desert. He was a product of the industrial heartland of the Midwest, born in Cincinnati, Ohio, into a devout Catholic family. He was a man of contradictions, a former champion swimmer who maintained athletic grace even in later years, and a crusading activist who would become the symbol of corporate greed and excess. He began his career as a lawyer, a sharp and aggressive advocate who quickly rose to prominence in financial circles. By the 1970s, he held the position of executive vice president at a major insurance company, American Financial Corporation, run by legendary Cincinnati financier Carl Lindner. It was at American Financial that Keating first encountered securities regulators. In 1979, the Securities and Exchange Commission accused Keating and Lindner of deceiving shareholders by approving multi-million-dollar loans to themselves and other executives. Keating, ever defiant, insisted on his innocence, but agreed to a settlement. A minor reprimand barely dampened his appetite for risk or his disdain for what he viewed as intrusive government officials. But this episode left its mark on him, a burning resentment that would fuel his later battles with regulators. By the early 1980s, Keating was ready to strike out on his own. He moved his family to Phoenix and founded his own company, American Continental Corporation. He started in real estate development, building massive planned communities in the Arizona desert, complete with golf courses, man-made lakes, and luxury homes. But Keating had bigger ambitions. He wanted to build a financial empire, and he had a clear strategy for how to achieve it. The key, in his view, was a savings and loan institution. The timing was perfect. The early 1980s saw a wave of deregulation sweep through the financial industry, a loosening of rules that had long governed thrifts. These institutions, once staid and conservative lenders focused on home mortgages, were now allowed to engage in a much broader range of investments, including high-yield junk bonds and speculative real estate deals. For someone like Charles Keating, this was an open door to paradise. In 1984, Keating set his sights on Lincoln Savings and Loan, a quiet, traditional thrift headquartered in Irvine, California. He acquired it through American Continental for $51 million. Almost immediately after taking control, Keating began transforming Lincoln into something unprecedented in finance. He saw it not as a savings and loan, but as his personal piggy bank. A vast pool of government-insured deposits he could leverage to fuel his ambitions and build wealth for himself and his family. Keating moved Lincoln's headquarters from Orange County's peaceful suburbs to the heart of his empire in Phoenix. He replaced the old conservative management with his own appointees, including his son, Charles Keating III, and other family members. He then began pouring Lincoln's money, federally insured up to $100,000 per account holder, into a dizzying array of risky ventures. He invested heavily in junk bonds, high-yield but precarious securities from companies with shaky credit ratings. He funneled cash into corporate takeovers, currency speculation, and massive speculative land developments like Scottsdale's extravagant Phoenician resort, a monument to luxury featuring a mother-of-pearl-lined swimming pool and imported marble. He tapped Lincoln's resources to fund his other businesses and support a lifestyle of almost unimaginable splendor for himself and his family, complete with mansions, private jets, and lavish parties. But Keating's boldest move, and ultimately most destructive one, was converting Lincoln's savings branches into outlets for selling risky, uninsured junk bonds issued by its parent company, American Continental. He instructed Lincoln's tellers and branch managers to act as aggressive salespeople, coaxing customers, often elderly or financially unsophisticated savers, to move their money from safe government-insured CDs into these worthless securities. The sales pitch was a masterpiece of deception. These bonds were sold within the comfortable, trusted confines of bank branches by familiar employees whom customers had relied on with their life savings. The sales representatives were directed to downplay the risks, emphasize the higher interest rates, and create the impression that the bonds were just as safe as the insured deposits they were replacing. Many investors had no idea they were trading their life savings for a piece of paper backed by nothing more than the empty promises of a financial predator. For a while, the scheme worked spectacularly well. American Continental's junk bonds raised hundreds of millions of dollars, which Keating used to power his ever-expanding empire. Lincoln's assets grew from just over $1 billion when he acquired it to more than $5 billion within a few short years. On paper, the company looked like an extraordinary success, a testament to Keating's financial genius. But it was all a house of cards built on a foundation of fraud and deception. In reality, Lincoln was hemorrhaging money. The speculative investments were failing. The junk bond market was beginning to collapse, and the real estate developments were consuming cash at an unsustainable rate. But Keating was a master of creative accounting. He used a series of sham transactions and fraudulent property deals to generate phantom profits, creating the illusion that Lincoln was thriving when it was actually approaching collapse. But even Keating's financial wizardry couldn't hide reality forever. By the mid-1980s, federal regulators were starting to get suspicious. The San Francisco office of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, the agency overseeing the savings and loan industry, launched an investigation into Lincoln's risky investment practices and apparent rule violations. The regulators, led by a determined and principled man named Edwin Gray, the FLBB chairman, soon discovered a swamp of fraud and dishonesty. They found that Lincoln had vastly exceeded legal limits on direct investments, was burdened by hundreds of millions in hidden losses, and was effectively insolvent. They recommended that authorities seize the institution to stop Keating's reckless and illegal actions before more harm could be done. But Charles Keating wasn't one to give up easily. He had spent years cultivating relationships with powerful allies in Washington, D.C., and now he was calling in those favors. He had contributed over $1 million to the campaign funds of 5 prominent U.S. senators: Alan Cranston of California, Dennis DeConcini, and John McCain of Arizona, John Glenn of Ohio, and Donald Regal of Michigan. Now he expected them to return the favor. In April 1987, the 5 senators, who would later become infamous as the Keating Five, met with FLBB regulators in a now legendary session in Senator DeConcini's office. Their message was clear: leave Charles Keating alone. The senators questioned the regulators' reasoning, accused them of overzealousness, and pressed them to give Keating a break. It was a brazen and astonishing example of political interference, an attempt to use their power and influence to shield a major donor from facing consequences for his actions. The meeting achieved its purpose. The investigation into Lincoln was delayed, transferred from the aggressive San Francisco office to the more compliant FLBB headquarters in Washington. For 2 critical years, Keating managed to continue his plundering of Lincoln, selling more worthless bonds to unsuspecting investors, and driving the institution further toward disaster. But by 1989, the charade could no longer be maintained. The real estate market had crashed. The junk bond market was spiraling out of control, and Lincoln was drowning in massive losses. The regulators could no longer be held at bay. On April 14, 1989, federal authorities finally seized Lincoln's savings and loan. The collapse of Lincoln was catastrophic. It became the most expensive thrift failure in U.S. history, a fiasco that would ultimately cost taxpayers over $3 billion. But the personal toll was even more severe. Over 23,000 people, mostly elderly Californians who had entrusted Lincoln with their retirement savings, were left holding worthless American Continental junk bonds. Their retirement dreams were shattered, their futures ruined, their faith in the system permanently damaged. The stories that emerged after the failure were deeply heartbreaking. The retired teacher who had lost her entire $150,000 life savings. The elderly couple who had planned to use their money for their grandchildren's college education, now left with nothing. The widow who had been persuaded to swap her safe insured deposits for the promise of higher returns, only to end up destitute and alone. The collapse of Lincoln's savings and loans sent shockwaves through the financial industry and Washington's corridors of power. The Keating Five scandal erupted into a major political firestorm, resulting in a lengthy Senate Ethics Committee investigation. Ultimately, Senator Cranston was formally censured while the other 4 senators faced criticism for poor judgment. For many, it felt like a token punishment, a sign that the powerful weren't subject to the same rules as ordinary people. But for Charles Keating, the day of reckoning was coming. He had become America's most hated man, the face of the savings and loan crisis, representing everything wrong with the greedy, get-rich-quick culture of the 1980s. The legal battles that followed were epic, a prolonged and fierce war fought in courtrooms on both coasts. In 1990, Keating was indicted by California on 42 counts of securities fraud data. The trial became a media circus, high-stakes courtroom drama. Prosecutors portrayed Keating as a ruthless predator who had deliberately defrauded thousands of unsuspecting investors. Keating, remaining defiant, testified on his own behalf, casting himself as an innovative entrepreneur targeted by overzealous regulators. But the jury wasn't convinced. In 1991, they convicted him, resulting in a 10-year prison sentence. But the state case was just the beginning. The federal government was building a comprehensive case against him as well. That same year, Keating was indicted on 73 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The federal trial proved even more complex and far-reaching than the state case. It delved deep into the labyrinthine world of Keating's financial dealings. Prosecutors exposed the full extent of his deception, the fake deals, fabricated profits, and plundering of Lincoln for personal gain. In 1993, a federal jury convicted Keating on every charge. He received a sentence of 12.5 years in prison to begin after his state sentence. It seemed that justice had finally prevailed. The Desert King was now a convicted felon. His empire lay in ruins, his name synonymous with white-collar crime. But Charles Keating's story hadn't reached its end. A tireless fighter, he continued challenging his convictions from behind prison walls. Then came a stunning reversal. His legal struggles began bearing fruit. In 1996, a federal judge overturned his state conviction, citing improper jury instructions from the trial judge. 3 years later, his federal conviction was similarly vacated because certain jurors had been influenced by knowledge of his prior state conviction. Charles Keating walked free, at least temporarily. But federal prosecutors weren't willing to let him escape unscathed. They prepared to retry him on the fraud charges, and Keating, now nearing 80 with failing health, seemed to have finally lost his fighting spirit. In 1999, he negotiated a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of bankruptcy fraud, admitting he had illegally transferred company assets to family members. He received credit for the 50 months already served and was released. The legal saga of Charles Keating had finally ended. He spent his remaining years in quiet obscurity, a shadow of his former self. He died in 2014 at 90 years old, a man who had once scaled the heights only to watch everything collapse around him. The fall of the Keating Empire remains relevant today, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked greed, the corrupting influence of money and political power, and the profound human cost of corporate misconduct. This story is about a man who believed himself above the law, who built an empire on lies, and who left behind a trail of financial and personal devastation. It stands as a powerful and enduring testament to the fragility of trust, the necessity of accountability, and the timeless truth that no matter how high a house of cards may rise, it remains forever vulnerable to collapse. Story 3. The evening of October 4th, 1991, began like any other in the modest western district of Decatur, Alabama, a small town nestled beside the Tennessee River. Ludie Mae Tucker, a 69-year-old woman and longtime resident of her home, was preparing for bed with her visiting cousin, Moselle Dutton. This was primarily a black neighborhood, a tight-knit community where residents knew each other and offered mutual support. Directly across the street lived Robin Rocky Myers, a man in his early 30s sharing his home with his family, including his 11-year-old son, Leandrew. The Tucker residence frequently sold ice to neighbors, and Rocky's household had been among their customers, having entered her home on several occasions. Ludi May was familiar with Rocky Myers. She had seen him many times. She would recognize him on sight. This detail would prove to be of immense importance in what followed. Around midnight, the doorbell rang at Ludi May Tucker's home. Moselle Dutton, in another room, heard a male voice asking to use the telephone. Then she heard Ludi May calling her name. An intruder forced his way inside, and in the chaos that followed, he attacked both women with a knife. He entered Dutton's dark room and stabbed her in the side before fleeing the house. Dutton only managed a brief glimpse of her attacker, noting that he appeared to be wearing a light-colored shirt. When she left her room, pressing her hand against the wound, she found Ludi May on the couch, bleeding and clutching the telephone. Ludi May had been stabbed 4 times, with one particularly severe wound on the left side of her chest. But with extraordinary composure and determination, she managed to dial 911 and was speaking with the Decatur police when Dutton found her. In those critical moments, as help rushed to the scene and Ludi May Tucker was dying from her injuries, she described her attacker to authorities. She told them it was a black male who was short and heavy-set. She detailed the clothing he wore, a light-colored shirt. But even though she knew Rocky Myers, even though his family had bought ice from her repeatedly, even though she had seen him many times before, Ludi May Tucker did not name Rocky Myers as the one who attacked her. As Rocky's son Leandrew would later point out, if it had been his father who hurt her, all she had to do was say it was the man who lived across the street. She had enough breath to describe the attacker's build. If Rocky had been responsible, she would have identified him. Ludi May Tucker died from her injuries, and Moselle Dutton survived the attack. But the killing set in motion an investigation that would eventually result in one of Alabama's most troubling death penalty cases. The events that unfolded in the following months and years would expose serious flaws in the justice system. Questionable witness testimony obtained through police coercion, a complete lack of forensic evidence, inadequate legal representation, intellectual disability issues, racial bias, and the now abolished judicial override practice that allowed a judge to impose a death sentence. The investigation initially focused on different suspects. Several witness statements accused another local man of the murder, but then an acquaintance of that man's family learned about a reward being offered for information on the case, and decided to come forward with details that would shift the entire direction of the investigation. This person gave detectives a statement accusing someone completely different, a black male who was short and stocky, Rocky Myers, living right across from Ludi May Tucker and matching the physical description given, became the focus of the investigation. The crucial testimony against Rocky came from Marzo Ewing, an African-American witness who provided what the prosecution considered the most damning evidence against him. Ewing testified under oath that he had seen Rocky with a VCR belonging to Ludi May Tucker, supposedly linking him to the crime scene. This statement became fundamental to the prosecution's case, especially critical since there was no forensic evidence whatsoever connecting Rocky to the murder. Rocky Myers insisted he had found the VCR discarded in the street. But Rocky suffered from an intellectual disability that affected his ability to express himself and understand complex situations. His reading ability was at 4th grade level. When officers questioned him about when and where he found the VCR, his cognitive challenges prevented him from providing the kind of precise, logical timeline that investigators expect. Law enforcement interpreted his struggles as signs of deception when they were actually due to mental limitations. The case built by prosecutors against Rocky Myers was purely circumstantial. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. No fingerprints found at Ludi May Tucker's home matched Rocky's. Before her death, the victim had not identified him as her attacker, even though she knew him. Several people who testified at Rocky's trial said he was wearing a dark shirt the evening of the killing, contradicting the light-colored shirt both Ludi May and Moselle had described. Nevertheless, Rocky Myers, who had no history of violent behavior, was arrested and charged with capital murder. At his trial in 1994, more than 2 years after Ludie Mae Tucker's death, he faced a jury. One member of that jury later used a racial slur when referring to Rocky, exposing the prejudice that tainted the proceedings. The trial took place in an environment where race relations heavily influenced outcomes. Making matters worse, Rocky was defended by an ineffective lawyer who failed to provide a strong defense. His attorney didn't properly challenge the circumstantial nature of the evidence, didn't emphasize enough the lack of physical proof, and didn't effectively communicate to jurors the significance of Ludie Mae Tucker's failure to identify Rocky as her attacker. For someone with cognitive limitations facing a capital murder charge in a biased system, the quality of legal representation was truly a life or death matter. Rocky was denied the defense he needed and deserved. Despite the weak evidence and questionable aspects of the prosecution's case, the jury convicted Rocky Myers of capital murder. But when it came time to recommend a sentence, something remarkable happened. The jury voted 9-3 in favor of sentencing Rocky to life in prison without parole instead of death. A juror named Paulette later described the deliberations. She and several other jurors had significant doubts about the charges and evidence against Rocky. They worried that if they couldn't reach a verdict and a mistrial resulted, another jury might sentence Rocky to death. So they reached a compromise. They would convict him to avoid a mistrial, but would recommend life in prison over the death penalty. This decision came from pragmatism and fear, trying to prevent what they saw as a worse outcome. Normally, a jury's sentencing recommendation carries considerable weight and is usually followed by the judge. But Alabama, at that time, operated under judicial override, a practice that allowed judges to decree death sentences even when juries had recommended life behind bars. This procedure was unique to Alabama. It undermined jury's role and placed enormous power with individual judges. The judge presiding over Rocky's case used this power. He overturned the jury's 9-3 recommendation for life imprisonment and instead sentenced Rocky Myers to death. Rocky was sent to Alabama's death row, where he would remain for 30 years fighting for his life. The judicial override practice that sealed his fate would eventually be abolished in Alabama. But this reform came too late for Rocky and others already sentenced under that system. As years passed, and Rocky remained on death row, disturbing revelations began emerging about the evidence used to convict him. In 2004, 13 years after the murder, and 10 years after Rocky's conviction, Marzell Ewing, the witness whose testimony had been the most incriminating evidence against Rocky, came forward with a shocking confession. Ewing recanted his testimony, stating in a signed affidavit that his statements to the jury were false. He explicitly said, "I did not see who brought the VCR to the shot house that night." More alarmingly, Ewing revealed that an investigator had suggested clearing a prior arrest record if Ewing testified against Rocky Myers. The testimony that had been instrumental in sending Rocky to death row had been obtained through police coercion and an implied deal incentivizing Ewing to implicate Rocky regardless of the truth. Ewing admitted he had lied, that law enforcement had pressured him, and that he avoided a car theft charge because of his agreement to testify against Rocky. This revelation cast doubt on the entire case. The prosecution's key witness had confessed to lying. His testimony was coerced through police pressure and offers of leniency, and there had never been any physical evidence linking Rocky to the crime. The case against Rocky Myers rested on an unstable foundation, but another devastating setback would delay justice even longer for him. After his conviction, Rocky was assigned an attorney for his appeals process. A Tennessee lawyer volunteering through a national organization providing free legal help to death row inmates. This lawyer, referred to in court records only as Earl, took on Rocky's case and began work on his initial state-level appeals. Then suddenly and without explanation, the attorney abandoned the case. He deserted Rocky's legal matter during ongoing state post-conviction appeal proceedings and failed to notify Rocky that he had stopped representing him. Rocky, whose reading ability was at a fourth-grade level because of his intellectual disability, was completely unaware that his lawyer had left. He had no idea that crucial deadlines were approaching and that no one was handling his appeals. When Rocky finally learned he had been abandoned by his attorney, it was too late. The deadline for filing his federal habeas corpus petition had passed in 2023. He had missed one of the most important deadlines in the appeals process, a time frame that might have offered a path to challenge his conviction and sentence. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals would later describe the lawyer's behavior as an inexcusable abandonment. But they also said that Rocky should have taken steps to monitor the progress of his case. For someone with an intellectual disability who struggled with reading, such expectations were impossible and inherently unfair. The United States Supreme Court has ruled that people with intellectual disabilities are at heightened risk of wrongful execution. The court acknowledged that those with cognitive limitations are more likely to give false confessions, less able to help in their defense, more vulnerable to police coercion, and less equipped to navigate the complex criminal justice system. Rocky Myers embodied each of these vulnerabilities. He had an intellectual disability. He had been burdened with incompetent legal counsel. His conviction rested on testimony from a witness who later admitted to lying because of police pressure. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the victim, who knew him, had not identified him as her attacker. As Rocky's case drew attention from advocacy groups like Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Death Penalty Information Center, more and more voices began calling for his execution to be stopped. Juror Paulette, who had voted to convict Rocky but had recommended a life sentence, publicly supported the clemency efforts. She expressed her belief in Rocky's innocence and that he faced unfair circumstances from the start. "It was a terrible, terrible situation, and it still is," she said. In February 2025, the Alabama Supreme Court authorized the state to proceed with Rocky's execution using nitrogen gas, a method recently added to Alabama's execution protocols. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall requested an execution date to be set, and the next step involved Governor Kay Ivey scheduling Rocky's execution. For Rocky's advocates, it seemed that time was running out. After spending over 30 years on death row, Rocky Myers was finally facing an imminent execution. But Governor Kay Ivey, a Republican who had overseen more than 20 executions since taking office in 2017, and who identified herself as a firm supporter of capital punishment, reached a surprising decision. On Friday, February 28th, 2025, she announced that she was commuting Rocky Myers' death sentence to life imprisonment without parole. In a written statement, Governor Ivey explained her reasoning with careful detail. "I am not convinced that Mr. Myers is innocent, but I am not convinced enough of his guilt to allow his execution," she wrote. She noted that she had enough doubts about Mr. Myers' guilt that she could not proceed with putting him to death. Ivey emphasized that she was honoring both the jury's decision to convict Rocky and their recommendation that he receive a life sentence without parole, the sentence they had recommended in 1994, before the judge overrode it. "In sum, I am not convinced that Mr. Myers is innocent, but I am not convinced enough of his guilt to allow his execution. I therefore must respect both the jury's decision to convict him and its recommendation that he be sentenced to life without parole," Ivey stated. She acknowledged it as one of the most difficult decisions I've made as governor. The commutation was a historic moment. It was the first execution Governor Fulvey had stopped since her first term began in 2017. Rocky Myers became the first person on Alabama's death row in recent memory to have their sentence commuted to life in prison. He was also the first African American on death row granted such clemency. The decision came despite strong opposition from Attorney General Steve Marshall, who expressed shock at Governor Fulvey's commutation. Marshall and other prosecutors were convinced of Rocky's guilt and believed he should be executed. But Ivy's statement made clear that she had examined the evidence and the numerous problems with the case, including the lack of physical evidence, the victim's failure to identify Rocky even though she knew him, the key witness recanting their testimony, the jury's plea for life imprisonment, and the troubling aspects of his intellectual disability and inadequate legal representation. Governor Ivy concluded her statement by expressing a hope that the Tucker family could somehow find comfort and peace with the resolution of this case, and the assurance that Mr. Myers would remain imprisoned for life. While Rocky would not be executed, he would also never be free. At 63, having endured over 30 years on death row for a crime he consistently denied committing, Rocky Myers would spend his remaining days in prison. For the advocacy groups that had long campaigned to save Rocky's life, the commutation represented a victory, though one tinged with sadness. The ACLU praised the decision as confirmation of their position that Rocky's trial was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Amnesty International, which had rallied global support for Rocky's pardon, commended Governor Ivey's choice as the right decision. But these groups also recognized that Rocky was still confined for a crime he might not have committed, and they pledged to continue their efforts to abolish capital punishment and reform the criminal justice system that had so profoundly failed him. The Rocky Myers case serves as a vivid example of potential failures in death penalty proceedings. A man with cognitive impairments, unable to communicate effectively with law enforcement or help in his own defense, was convicted solely on circumstantial evidence. The victim, who knew him, did not identify him as her attacker. The primary witness later admitted to giving false testimony because of police coercion. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. He had inadequate legal representation at trial, and was later abandoned by his appellate attorney. A jury recommended a life sentence, but a judge overturned their decision and ordered death. He languished on death row for over 3 decades before a governor finally acknowledged that too many doubts about his guilt existed to allow execution. Rocky Myers will spend the rest of his life in prison, continuing to maintain his innocence in Ludie Mae Tucker's killing. Whether he's actually guilty or innocent, his case epitomizes the justice system's failure to provide the fair trial and reliable judgment essential when the state considers taking a human life. The commutation of his death sentence saved Alabama from possibly executing an innocent man with intellectual challenges, a man convicted on recanted testimony and whose jury had urged mercy. But it cannot restore the 33 years Rocky spent on death row, nor can it answer the fundamental question of whether true justice was achieved in the handling of Ludie Mae Tucker's murder case. Story 4. On September 30th, 2020, the day dawned overcast and oppressive in San Francisco. The city was wrapped in an unusual mix of thick fog rolling in from the Pacific Ocean and acrid smoke from the fierce wildfires that had been consuming California's landscape for weeks. The conditions were so obscured that the iconic Golden Gate Bridge, usually a vivid red structure visible from miles away, was barely visible, its towers fading into the gloom above the bay. At 6:45 a.m., most of the city's residents were still asleep. Their daily routines had been disrupted by pandemic restrictions that had turned San Francisco into a quieter, stranger place. But 19-year-old Sydney West was already up and moving, preparing for what she thought would be a routine morning workout. Sydney was a freshman at the University of California, Berkeley, a bright young woman from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, who had also spent many of her formative years in the Pleasanton area near the Bay Area. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall, with light brown hair and blue eyes, she stood out in any crowd due to her height and striking appearance. But on this particular day, her height and features would be irrelevant. She would disappear into the fog and smoke as though she had never existed. Sydney's life in the months before her disappearance had been marked by significant hardship. During the summer of 2020, before moving to Berkeley, she had experienced a concussion that affected her recovery. It was severe enough that she decided to defer her admission to Berkeley until the fall term, wanting to give herself time to heal fully in body and mind. The pandemic had further complicated her adjustment to college life. She was attending classes online while living in the Bay Area, cut off from the traditional campus experience her classmates were enjoying. The isolation of remote learning, combined with the psychological strain of the pandemic, had been difficult for her. She had chosen to use the early morning hours for what had become an important part of her coping strategy: outdoor exercise. The Crissy Field area, located next to the Golden Gate Bridge within the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, was a popular spot for such activities. It was known as a place where people engaged in outdoor pursuits like cycling, jogging, and yoga. A parkland that offered both fitness opportunities and a break from the restricted life imposed by the pandemic. On many mornings, Sydney had taken this same route, walking or running in the area as a way to manage stress and maintain her well-being. That morning, Sydney scheduled a rideshare to take her to Crissy Field around 6:45 a.m. She was dressed for exercise in a light teal or turquoise hoodie, dark leggings or black shorts, and Vans sneakers with a tropical pattern. She carried a backpack before stepping out of the car and into the fog and smoke that had transformed the entire landscape into something dreamlike and almost alien. Security footage captured Sydney moving east from Crissy Field toward the Golden Gate Bridge, walking into the thickening mist. In those last video frames, she appeared to be walking steadily, her pace suggesting normal forward motion. Then she moved out of the camera's range, vanishing into the heavy fog and smoke that had made the morning feel like being inside a cloud. This was the last confirmed sighting of Sydney West. She didn't show up at work, though she had no job scheduled that day. She didn't return home as expected. No phone call reached her family. No text message arrived. No update appeared on social media. She had simply disappeared, as if the fog and smoke that day had somehow solidified and swallowed her whole. When Sydney didn't come home and couldn't be reached by phone, her family grew alarmed. Time passed without any communication. They called the San Francisco Police Department to report that their 19-year-old daughter was missing. Police accepted the report and began an investigation. But with little information about her whereabouts or what might have happened to her, the initial stages of the search were challenging. Sydney's family quickly took matters into their own hands. Driven by the desperation of not knowing where she was or what had happened, they alerted their contacts, reached out to friends and associates, and began organizing searches of the last known area where Sydney was spotted. The family decided to hire a private investigator, Scott Dudek, to pursue leads that official investigators might have missed. They were determined to find their daughter, to bring her home, to discover what happened on that fog-shrouded morning. By early 2021, several months after Sydney's disappearance, her family had pledged a $10,000 reward for tips leading to her safe recovery, later raising it to $25,000. Candlelight vigils were held in both North Carolina and California. A website was created specifically for her case, and social media campaigns were launched to keep her absence in the public eye. Private investigator Scott Dudek dedicated extensive time to the investigation, pursuing numerous leads and tips from the public. Meanwhile, the Missing Persons Unit within the Special Victims Division of the San Francisco Police Department was conducting its own investigation. They examined surveillance footage from various locations, conducted interviews with Sydney's circle of friends and acquaintances, and tracked down leads as they emerged. But progress was slow. Despite their efforts, the reward offered, the widespread awareness, and the private investigators' work, no concrete clues materialized about Sydney's fate. One significant physical item was recovered. Sydney's backpack was found in the area near the Golden Gate Bridge. This discovery suggested that she had reached the bridge. But exactly what happened there, and where she went afterward, remained unknown. Her parents were bewildered by the implications of the footage and the backpack's discovery, questioning what thoughts had been going through their daughter's mind and what had driven her to head toward the bridge on that foggy morning. The San Francisco Police Department classified Sydney as an at-risk missing person, mentioning in their public statements that she had experienced depression previously. The suggestion was difficult to ignore. Investigators were exploring the possibility that Sydney, struggling with mental health issues, feelings of isolation due to the pandemic, recovery from a concussion, and difficulties with online college courses, might have made a decision on that foggy morning that led to her death. After all, the Golden Gate Bridge is among the world's most frequented locations for suicides, a place where people in profound despair seek relief from their pain. But her family contested this inference, firmly maintaining that their daughter did not take her own life, and that something else had happened to her on that foggy morning. They pointed to the absence of any evidence of foul play, but also noted there was no proof of suicide, no body, no definitive explanation for her disappearance. They persisted in their search, clung to hope, and continued to reject the notion that Sydney had simply dissolved into the fog and smoke without a trace. The case drew considerable media attention, with Sydney's disappearance being featured on the television show Disappeared, which broadcast her story to viewers across the country. Despite the press coverage and the private investigators' work, no conclusive answers emerged. By 2023, 3 years after her disappearance, Sydney West remained missing, her fate unclear, her final moments shrouded in mystery. The San Francisco Police Department remained convinced that there was no indication of foul play, suggesting to those following the case that they believed Sydney had either left voluntarily or taken her own life. But her family and supporters disagreed, unwilling to accept that she would abandon them without notice or end her life on that particular morning. The absence of a body meant that the possibility of criminal involvement couldn't be entirely ruled out, even if existing evidence didn't support it. On September 30th, 2025, exactly 5 years after Sydney West disappeared into the fog and smoke near the Golden Gate Bridge, her family once again marked the anniversary of her disappearance. 5 years had passed without resolution. 5 years of questions. 5 years of hope mixed with despair. 5 years of an unresolved mystery about a 19-year-old woman who had simply left for her morning workout and never returned home. Jay West and Kimberly West spent those 5 years advocating for attention to their daughter's case. They stated publicly, "We know there was considerable foot traffic along with cars and bicycles on the Golden Gate Bridge when Sydney went missing. It's possible someone saw something. Any piece of information might help in finding Sydney." Now, they kept her private investigator contact information available for anyone with potential leads, and maintained their belief that one day the truth about their daughter's fate would emerge. The story of Sydney West stands as one of modern America's most heartbreaking unsolved cases. It contains multiple possible narratives, all equally tragic in their different ways. In one version, a young woman struggling with depression, the isolation of remote learning during the pandemic, and the after effects of a concussion, may have decided on a day when dense fog covered everything that her pain had become unbearable, and she may have sought release in the waters below the Golden Gate Bridge. This version frames her disappearance as a mental health tragedy and emotional suffering that reached a catastrophic conclusion. In another scenario, something different happened on that foggy morning. An encounter with one or more people under circumstances that led to her death or her abduction to an unknown location, leaving her fate unresolved. This version frames her disappearance as potentially involving criminal activity, suggesting it resulted from malicious intent rather than a personal decision to end her life. The discovery of her backpack near the bridge could support either interpretation. It might indicate she visited the bridge with suicidal intentions, or it could point to a confrontation or struggle occurring there. In a third theory, Sydney may have simply left, walking away from her old life and starting over somewhere far away, away from her family and her past. But given the absence of any messages or contact, and all signs pointing to her being in genuine distress, this possibility seems slim. For 5 years, Sydney West's family has endured the uncertainty, the lack of closure, and the agonizing not knowing of a case that remains essentially unsolved. They have held on to hope while watching the years slip by. They have continued to campaign for their daughter, even as they recognize that with each passing year, a resolution becomes less likely. They have maintained that someone might have seen something, believing that after 5 years without leads, a clue or detail could still emerge. Sydney West deserved better than to disappear into mystery and obscurity at age 19. She deserved the chance to finish her college education, to build a future, and to face the challenges typical of her age and personal struggles. She deserved for her fate to be clear, for there to be understanding about what happened that September morning in 2020. Her family deserved answers, and society deserved to know if a young woman had chosen to end her pain, or if something more sinister had occurred on the bridge that day. 5 years on, those answers remain elusive, lost in the fog and smoke that Sydney walked into on that terrible morning. Her disappearance continues unsolved, a mystery that still haunts her family and those following her story. A testament that sometimes the answers to our deepest questions are never found, and those we love can vanish from our lives, leaving behind only questions and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Story 5 down. On the morning of October 25th, 2024, dawn broke over Chicago's South Loop neighborhood, where sleek high-rise buildings stood against the urban skyline, their steel and glass facades reflecting the autumn sunlight. Inside one such upscale residence at 1201 South Prairie Avenue, Caitlin Tracy, a 36-year-old technology executive whose life seemed to be on a promising trajectory, was moments away from a brutal death that would shock the neighborhood and raise urgent questions about domestic violence, the justice system's failures in protecting those at risk, and the calculated deception of a man willing to commit the... For months, Caitlin Tracy had been living a double life. She maintained a home in New Buffalo, Michigan, a quiet lakeside community on Lake Michigan's shore where she had sought refuge and safety. But her estranged husband, Adam Beckerink, a 47-year-old attorney and tech industry executive, lived in the South Loop condominium in Chicago, a setting defined by glass and steel, modern luxury, and urban sophistication. The couple was going through divorce proceedings, their marriage crumbling under the weight of violence, control, and abuse that had characterized their relationship. The history of violent incidents between Caitlin and Adam stretched back several years, documented in legal filings, police reports, and the testimony of a woman desperately trying to escape someone she had once loved. In October 2023, Caitlin had filed for a protective order against her husband, detailing 4 separate incidents where he had subjected her to physical and emotional harm. She described her fear, her profound concern that Adam would continue hurting her, and her need for legal protection from the man with whom she had built a life. But then something changed. Whether threatened, manipulated, or worn down by Adam's pressure, Caitlin withdrew the protective order. According to court documents, her husband had threatened her with lawsuits for defamation and dishonesty if she proceeded, using the legal system and the threat of financial ruin to silence a woman asking for protection from abuse. With the protective order canceled, Caitlin was left vulnerable. In 2024, the year her life would end violently, the abuse continued. Police arrested Adam Beckerink twice in New Buffalo, Michigan for domestic incidents involving Caitlin. The pattern was becoming clear to authorities. A man with a history of violence, a woman trying to break free, and a relentless aggressor who refused to accept his marriage's end. On October 24, 2024, security footage captured Adam and Caitlin together at his South Loop apartment. What transpired between them? What argument or confrontation occurred? is known only to Adam Beckerink. But on the next day, October 25th, 2024, Caitlin Tracy would be dead, having fallen or been pushed from the 24th floor of the building's eastern stairwell. According to the criminal complaint filed by Chicago police, Adam Beckerink didn't simply allow his wife to fall. He threw her. He grabbed her and hurled her over the stairwell railing, causing her to plummet 24 floors inside the building. The fall measured approximately 280 feet, a descent so severe, so violent, that Caitlin's body would be completely destroyed upon impact. On October 26, 2024, one day after Caitlin died, Adam Beckerink called the Chicago Police Department to report his wife missing. He claimed he hadn't seen her in more than 30 days, a statement directly contradicting security footage showing him with her at his apartment just 24 hours earlier. The lie was calculated, designed to feign separation, to suggest Caitlin's disappearance was unrelated to him, that he was simply a concerned husband reporting his wife absent. Authorities brought Beckerink in for questioning, and he was held for 48 hours. But lacking evidence directly tying him to Caitlin's death, without a body, without crucial proof investigators needed, he was released without charges. He left still wearing his wedding ring, still portraying himself as a grieving husband. On October 27, 2024, 48 hours after Caitlin's death, a resident in the building made a horrifying discovery. A severed foot was found in a stairwell. The foot was identified as Caitlin Tracy's. The body, having been so shattered by falling 24 stories, had literally disintegrated. Police searched the building and found Caitlin's body at the base of the stairwell in the basement area, where she had landed after the fall. Initially, authorities classified the death as accidental, though investigators noted the height from which she had fallen and began considering other possibilities. Had Caitlin simply jumped from the stairwell, would a healthy 36-year-old woman have done so? Had she slipped? Could she have fallen such a distance that her body would fragment? Or had something else happened? Something more violent, more intentional, more indicative of murder? For nearly 12 months, Caitlin Tracy's remains were at the center of a custody dispute between Adam Beckerink and her parents. Beckerink wanted to control what happened with her body while Caitlin's devastated family fought for the right to bury their daughter according to their own wishes and customs. The battle lasted over 2 weeks until a Michigan judge finally granted Caitlin's parents legal control over their daughter's remains. During this time, Adam Beckerink was facing charges in Michigan for domestic assault. On August 29, 2025, he entered a no-contest plea to charges of domestic battery and violating a no-contact order. This agreement spared prosecutors from having to prove his guilt in court, but it also prevented the public from learning the full extent of the abuse Caitlin had endured. From the courtroom, her mother, Dr. Monica Tracy, denounced her son-in-law, stating, "Our daughter didn't stand a chance with this monster. She was battered, bruised, and abused by this monster." He then controlled her and took her phone away when she tried to call for help. On October 20th, 2025, Adam Beckerink received a sentence in Michigan of 93 days in jail for his domestic violence convictions. At his sentencing hearing, he still wore his wedding ring and told the court that he missed and loved his wife. Then, on October 27th, 2025, exactly 1 year after Caitlin's body was discovered, an arrest warrant was issued for Adam Beckerink, charging him with first-degree murder in the death of his estranged wife. The criminal complaint alleged that he had thrown her over the railing from the 24th floor stairwell, causing her fatal injuries. These charges came while Beckerink was still held in the Berrien County Jail in Michigan, completing his 93-day sentence for domestic abuse. The evidence supporting the murder charge was circumstantial but compelling. Security footage captured Beckerink and Tracy together at his apartment on October 24th, contradicting his claim that he hadn't seen her for more than 30 days. No other individuals had entered the stairwell at the time of her death. The history of abuse, the control he maintained over her, along with the threats and violence documented in police files, all pointed to a man capable of murder. But the case also exposed Adam Beckerink's alarming behavior in the time between Caitlin's death and his arrest for murder. At a Concentra urgent care facility in Chicago, where he had been ordered to go for court-mandated drug testing, Beckerink displayed disturbing actions. According to police reports and court documents, he consumed alcohol and became intoxicated. He demonstrated threatening and aggressive behavior toward clinic staff. He made unwanted physical contact with an employee's hand and asked her on a date. Then, most shockingly, he entered the bathroom and exposed himself inappropriately to the clinic staff, defecating on himself on the floor. This behavior was so alarming that it resulted in an additional charge of contempt of court. A Berrien County judge noted that Beckerink had drunk alcohol and appeared intoxicated while displaying intimidating and threatening behavior toward staff. The actions showed a pattern of escalating poor judgment, a growing disregard for social norms and human decency, and the kind of unrestrained behavior typical of someone with little remaining concern for consequences or propriety. For Caitlin Tracy's family, the first-degree murder charge represented a bittersweet form of justice. In a statement released after the charges were announced, the family said, "1 year ago today, we learned that Caitlin Tracy, our beloved daughter and sister, was found dead at the bottom of a stairwell in Adam Beckerink's Chicago South Loop condominium building after falling 24 floors." The statement added, "He will now be charged with her first-degree murder." Just 1 week earlier, Adam Beckerink, a convicted felon, had been sentenced in Michigan for tampering with Caitlin's cell phone and committing domestic abuse toward her. The case of Caitlin Tracy and Adam Beckerink illustrates a profound failure in multiple systems designed to protect vulnerable people. Caitlin filed for a protective order in 2023, seeking legal intervention to shield herself from a man she feared. But when her husband threatened to sue her for defamation and lies, she withdrew the protection request. The legal system meant to defend her was turned into a weapon used against her, a tool her abuser wielded to silence her and keep her trapped. He was arrested twice in Michigan for domestic violence involving Caitlin. Yet he remained free, able to travel between Michigan and Illinois, able to maintain contact with his estranged wife, able to pursue and manipulate her. The restraining orders that should have separated them were violated multiple times. The no-contact orders meant to isolate them were breached as Beckerink interfered with her cell phone and tried to control her communications. And then on October 25th, 2024, if the allegations are true, Adam Beckerink committed the ultimate act in his pattern of power and domination. At the moment Caitlin tried to leave, when she sought distance and independence, when she would no longer tolerate being controlled, he threw her from a 24-story stairwell. Caitlin Tracy was 36 years old. She was a technology executive, a career-driven woman advancing professionally. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, a person loved by those who wanted her to survive. She deserved safety. She was entitled to protection. She earned the right to escape an abusive relationship and begin again, away from the man who had hurt her time and time again. But she died in that stairwell, her body falling 24 floors, torn apart and shattered by the violence of her husband's actions. And it took a year, an entire year, for him to be charged with her murder. The case of Adam Beckerink and Caitlin Tracy serves as a tragic testament to the reality of intimate partner violence, the deadly potential of escalating abuse, and the way the legal system can fail to protect even when there are clear warning signs, documented incidents of violence, and explicit pleas for help from the victim. As the criminal trial moves forward, as prosecutors build their case for first-degree murder charges, as Adam Beckerink faces the consequences of his alleged actions, Caitlin Tracy remains dead, unable to see justice delivered or participate in the court proceedings that bear her name. Her family continues to mourn, to search for answers, to advocate for accountability and reform. And her story joins the list as one more heartbreaking chapter in the ongoing crisis of domestic violence across America. A stark reminder that for many women, the path from abuse to freedom ends not with safety, but with death. Story 6. On a June morning in 2008, the day began routinely at the Womack Army Medical Center on Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with the maternity ward bustling with the familiar rhythm of new life. But by mid-morning, a troubling silence had fallen over the department. Second Lieutenant Holly Wemunk, an Army nurse known for her dependability and compassion, had failed to report for duty. Her co-workers exchanged worried glances. Holly wasn't someone who would disappear without explanation. She was a dedicated worker, a mother to 2 young children, and someone who took her responsibilities seriously. After attempts to reach Holly at her apartment went unanswered, a group of concerned colleagues decided to check on her. They drove to her home in Fayetteville, the vibrant military community just outside Fort Bragg's gates. As they approached her building, they were stopped by a distinct smell. Smoke. The sharp scent of something burned hung in the air, coming from Holly's apartment door. Their concern turned to panic. They immediately called the police. Fayetteville officers arrived quickly and forced entry into the apartment. Inside, they found what would set in motion one of the area's most disturbing criminal investigations. Signs of deliberate arson were everywhere. The back bedroom's interior walls were coated in soot, and investigators soon noted several spots where fires had been intentionally set. The blaze had died out before it could consume the entire apartment, but it had achieved its malicious purpose: to destroy evidence. Holly's car sat parked outside, her keys and personal belongings apparently left behind, but Holly was nowhere to be found. As detectives sifted through the charred apartment debris, a grim picture began to form. This was no accident. The calculated way the fire was set, Holly's unexplained absence, and the timing of her disappearance all pointed to something intensely personal and frighteningly planned. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person case to something far more ominous. With the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, local police, and military authorities working together to piece together Holly Wemunk's fate, investigators needed to examine the months leading up to her disappearance. Their findings revealed a woman caught in an escalating and dangerous marriage. Holly had married Marine Corporal John Wemunk roughly a year earlier, a partnership that initially seemed promising. But beneath the surface of their military marriage, turmoil was brewing. By early 2008, their relationship had crumbled into something frightening. Divorce filings told a horrifying story. Holly had sought a protective order against her husband, outlining a pattern of escalating violence and threats that left her fearful for her safety. In one alarming incident, she recounted how John had pressed a gun to her head and threatened to kill her. She described being choked, thrown around their home, and terrorized by a man who had once promised to love and protect her. The documents painted a picture of a woman desperately trying to escape an abusive relationship while navigating the complex social fabric of military life. But domestic abuse cases often follow a heartbreaking trajectory, and Holly's situation was no different. When it came time to face her husband in court to uphold the restraining order, she couldn't find the courage to go through with it. Maybe it was fear. Perhaps it was the faint hope that the man she married still existed inside the person who had threatened her. Maybe she believed, as many domestic violence victims do, that he wouldn't actually hurt her. For whatever reason, Holly didn't attend the scheduled court hearing, and the restraining order was dismissed in late May 2008. That decision would prove fatal. Less than 6 weeks later, on the evening of July 8, 2008, Holly met with friends for what should have been a routine outing. Surveillance footage captured her using her ATM card. She appeared relaxed, unaware that these would be her last normal moments. Investigators later concluded that Holly was last seen alive that evening. The events of the following hours are known only to her killer, but evidence would ultimately reveal a story of planned murder, savage brutality, and frantic attempts to hide an appalling crime. The breakthrough in the case came on July 13, 2008, 5 days after Holly went missing. In a location far from her Fayetteville apartment, firefighters responding to a brush fire call in Onslow County, in a wooded area near Camp Lejeune, approximately 130 miles from Fort Bragg, made a ghastly discovery. Amid scorched vegetation and smoldering earth, Division of Forest Resources personnel uncovered human remains in a shallow grave. The body had been burned, apparently to destroy evidence, and the fire meant to consume it had spread to nearby brush, unintentionally drawing authorities' attention to the site. District Attorney Dewey Hudson later commented on the case's tragic irony. If the perpetrator had chosen to burn the remains in an open area just 100 feet away, they might have remained undiscovered. But the very act meant to conceal the crime ended up revealing it. The body was so severely burned that visual identification was impossible. But detectives had strong suspicions about the deceased's identity, and their worst fears were quickly validated. This was Holly Monk, daughter. An autopsy revealed the full brutality of the crime. Holly had died from a gunshot wound to the head, but her attacker had gone further. Her body had been dismembered and set on fire, first in her home and then in the shallow burial site where she was found. Before being buried, the remains had been wrapped in an air mattress, a grim detail that hinted at the chilling premeditation involved in the murder. The investigation progressed rapidly. Authorities had already questioned Marine Corporal John Monk in the days after his wife went missing. He had been their primary person of interest from the beginning, given their bitter divorce proceedings and documented history of domestic abuse. On Sunday, July 13th, the same day Holly's body was discovered, John Monk and another Marine, Lance Corporal Kyle Ryan Alden, were taken into custody and initially faced arson charges. But as investigators compiled evidence from both crime scenes and conducted thorough questioning, the charges were elevated. John Monk was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree arson. Kyle Alden was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree arson, conspiracy to commit arson, and being an accessory after the fact to first-degree murder. The evidence against John Monk was compelling. Investigators were able to verify crucial facts through witness statements and physical evidence from both the Fayetteville apartment and the wooded area near Camp Lejeune. They determined that Holly had been murdered in her apartment and that her body had been transported over 130 miles to a remote location in an attempt to destroy evidence. The fire at her home had been set in multiple places as a calculated effort to erase any traces of the crime, but it extinguished itself before accomplishing that goal. The physical clues left behind would prove crucial in building the case against her husband. Kyle Alden's mother insisted her son was innocent, claiming he had simply driven a friend to Fayetteville and was unaware of what was happening. But investigators painted a different picture. Alden's cooperation and detailed statements to law enforcement provided vital information that helped reconstruct the timeline and verify other evidence. Both men were held without bail at Cumberland County Jail pending their trials. The incident sent shockwaves through the military community at Fort Bragg and beyond. Holly's disappearance was the second in a disturbing series of violent acts targeting female soldiers stationed there that summer. Just weeks earlier, on June 21st, 2008, Army Specialist Megan Tuma, who was 7 months pregnant, had been found murdered in a Fayetteville hotel room. Megan had been at Fort Bragg for only 10 days when she was killed. The proximity of these crimes in both time and location prompted serious questions about the safety of women in the military and fueled fears that a serial predator might be targeting female personnel. Though these concerns would later prove unfounded, they reflected the palpable atmosphere of fear that gripped the Fort Bragg community during the summer of 2008. 3 female soldiers lost their lives between June and September that year, marking one of the darkest periods in the base's history. For Holly's family, especially her father, D. Wymunk, in Derry, New Hampshire. The news was a crushing blow. Dee had been desperately awaiting updates on his daughter as investigators raced to find her, not knowing she had already been murdered. Holly had been enthusiastic about her nursing career and her Army service. A graduate of St. Anselm College who received her commission from the Army Nurse Corps in 2007, she was stationed at Fort Bragg as her first assignment. She had a full life ahead of her and 2 children who depended on their mother. Instead, she became another tragic figure in the widespread problem of domestic violence, a woman killed by someone who once promised to love her. In later interviews, D. Wymunk would speak about his difficult awakening to domestic violence realities. He admitted he hadn't been well versed in its warning signs before Holly's death, but never imagined his son-in-law would actually take his daughter's life. This sentiment was echoed by many who knew the couple, including Holly's friends and family, who had watched their marriage deteriorate but never envisioned it ending in such horrific violence. The legal process stretched over 2 years before reaching its conclusion. On Monday, September 13, 2010, John Patrick Wymunk appeared before a North Carolina court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder charges. By accepting the plea agreement, he avoided the death penalty, but ensured he would never be released. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. This guilty plea meant no trial would take place, denying Holly's family the opportunity to confront him publicly and seek answers. But it also spared them the ordeal of a lengthy trial and the possibility that a jury might reach a different verdict. The story of Holly Wymunk is a tragedy whose impact extends far beyond the case's specifics. She was 24 years old at her death, a trained nurse committed to bringing new life into the world. She was a mother, daughter, and friend. She had served her country honorably and had a promising professional future ahead. But she was also a woman trapped in a violent relationship. Someone who bravely sought help and protection only to discover that the systems designed to protect her had failed. Her case serves as a harsh reminder of domestic abuse realities and the unique challenges faced by military families. The cancellation of her protective order when she missed her court date removed one of her few legal safeguards. Whether fear, hope, or other factors prevented her court appearance, the outcome was the same. She became vulnerable to the man who would murder her. Her story mirrors those of countless other domestic violence survivors who were torn between their desire to escape and the immense obstacles, emotional, social, legal, and practical, that make leaving an abusive situation so difficult and dangerous. Ultimately, Holly Wymunk's disappearance wasn't a traditional mystery. It didn't involve an unknown assailant or random violence. It was the culmination of an abusive cycle that had escalated over months, documented in legal filings, and witnessed by loved ones, yet ultimately not stopped before its fatal conclusion. The evidence of arson in her home, the discovery of her remains in a shallow grave over 100 miles away, and her husband's final guilty plea all confirmed what detectives had suspected from the start. But this was a domestic violence murder carried out by the person meant to be her partner and protector. Today, Holly's name is added to the list of far too many women killed by intimate partners, a sobering statistic in America's ongoing domestic violence epidemic. But she was more than just a number. She was a person with dreams, talents, and people who loved her. Her death left 2 children without a mother and a father without a daughter. It shook a community and permanently changed a workplace that lost her presence. It also left unanswered questions about potential interventions that might have saved her life. Holly Wymunk's case endures as a powerful reminder of the critical need for better protections for domestic abuse survivors, greater recognition of warning signs, and stronger systems to intervene before escalating violence becomes lethal. Her life mattered. Her death matters. And her story persists as both a tragic loss and a call to action for everyone working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Story 7. The spring of 2015 brought mild weather and blooming flowers to the outskirts of Gaithersburg, Maryland, a peaceful community where families lived in quiet neighborhoods and raised their children with the belief that home should be a place of safety and love. In one such suburban home lived 5-year-old Daniel Dana with his mother, Nargis Shefeha, a 33-year-old woman embroiled in a bitter custody battle with the boy's father, Hamd Dana. Daniel was their only child, born from a marriage that had ended in divorce, leaving behind a trail of resentment, anger, and a legal war waged in courtrooms over who would gain custody of the child. The marriage between Nargis and Hamdana had deteriorated into something ugly and hostile, marked by conflict and mutual accusations. When the divorce was finalized, when the legal documents were signed, and the marriage officially dissolved, the real battle began. The custody fight for Daniel. Hamed sought custody of his son. Nargis was unwilling to relinquish control over her only child. She had become obsessed with preventing Daniel from developing a meaningful relationship with his father, jealous of the time he spent away from her, and increasingly desperate to win the custody battle. Throughout the divorce and custody proceedings, allegations of abuse surfaced, with both parents accusing each other of mistreatment. Hamed, convinced that Nargis was an unfit mother, hired a private investigator to gather evidence against her, to prove her incompetence as a parent, and strengthen his case for custody. The legal battle dragged on through months of acrimony, accusations, and heated arguments over the fate of a 5-year-old boy who was simply caught in the crossfire. Nargis's obsession with the custody battle had become all-consuming. She was furious at her ex-husband, enraged that he wanted to take her son from her, convinced she was being treated unfairly by the system. In her mind, the custody fight had become so paramount that it overshadowed everything else. Her responsibilities as a mother, her moral obligations to protect her child, and the very reason she had fought so hard to keep him. In the days before June 2015, just before Summer's arrival and a crucial custody hearing scheduled to take place, Nargis sent a text message to her ex-husband that revealed the darkness of her mindset. "I will make you cry. You will be sorry. The message was a threat wrapped in the language of a woman consumed by rage and despair. On June 25, 2015, that custody hearing was scheduled. It was the day a judge would make decisions about Daniel's future, decisions that could result in Hamed gaining greater or even primary custody of his son. For Nargis, this outcome was unbearable. She couldn't face the possibility that the custody battle might end with her losing control over Daniel, that her son might spend more time with his father, or that someone else might have influence in raising her only child. But on the morning of June 25, 2015, Daniel didn't arrive at school. He didn't appear at the custody hearing. Instead, a series of deliberate and intentional acts initiated by his mother ensured he would never reach anywhere again. Nargis administered a fatal overdose of cold medication to her 5-year-old son, a mixture of Advil, Tylenol, and Mucinex, given in doses designed to kill a young child. The amounts were so excessive that Daniel's system contained 2.5 times the drug levels lethal to an adult. The cold medicine was an antihistamine, and the dosage so massive that accidental ingestion of such an amount by Daniel would have been impossible. Nargis didn't simply give the overdose and then immediately seek medical help. Instead, she waited. She drove around with her son in the car while the poison circulated through his small body. She continued forcing him to take more medicine, watching as the drugs ravaged his system, waiting for his death. Daniel, a 5-year-old boy who depended on his mother to care for him, was being murdered slowly and deliberately, abandoned to die by the person who should have loved him most. As Daniel lay dying, as he lost consciousness, and his body began to fail under the assault of overdosed drugs, Nargis devised a plan. She couldn't allow his death to be traced back to poisoning. She couldn't let an autopsy reveal she had given him an overdose. She needed a cover story, something to explain his death, something to deflect suspicion from her and toward an accident. So she obtained gasoline. She poured it into her car and set it on fire, planning to stage the death as a terrible accident, a fiery crash in which her 5-year-old son was fatally burned. She placed Daniel's lifeless body in the back seat of the car and doused him with gasoline. Then she ignited the fire, watching as flames consumed the vehicle and the remains of her only child. Once the fire had fully engulfed the car, Nargis fled from the scene. Paramedics arriving at the emergency found her lying face down beside the driver's side of the charred vehicle. The scene appeared to be a heartbreaking accident, a mother and son caught in a fiery car crash. The kind of inexplicable tragedy that devastates families and communities. But as investigators began examining the evidence and conducting an autopsy, the true circumstances of what had happened emerged. Daniel hadn't died in the fire. The flames hadn't killed him while he was still alive. Rather, he had been fatally poisoned with an overdose of cold medication, and his body was placed in the car after death, staged as part of an elaborate scheme to disguise a murder with arson. The investigation moved forward as detectives questioned Nargis about her son's death. What stood out during these interrogations wasn't what she said, but what she didn't say. She didn't ask whether her son was still alive. She didn't ask how he had died. She didn't cry or show the profound grief expected of a mother who had just lost her child. Instead, she claimed that the overdose was accidental, that she had mistakenly given Daniel too much medication for his cold and became panicked when he stopped breathing. Detectives found her story implausible. The dosage in Daniel's system couldn't have been administered by accident. It was calculated to be lethal. The time elapsed before the fire was set indicated premeditation and planning, not panic and confusion. On October 31st, 2015, authorities charged Nargis Shafaya with first-degree murder and first-degree arson. The charges reflected their conclusion that she had intentionally poisoned her son and deliberately set the fire to cover up the crime. Nargis was arrested and held in custody. Her case drew significant media attention as news outlets throughout Maryland and beyond reported on its gruesome details. A mother who had killed her own child, apparently in an act of revenge against his father, had violated the most fundamental trust a child places in a parent. For over a year, the case moved through the legal system. Prosecutors built their case, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for trial. On July 27, 2016, more than a year after Daniel's death, Nargis Shafaya stood in court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She didn't go to trial. She made no attempt to fight the charges. She simply acknowledged that she had murdered her 5-year-old son. Her guilty plea shifted the focus from whether she had committed murder to what sentence would be imposed. On February 27, 2017, almost 2 years after she poisoned her son and set his body on fire, Nargis Shafaya appeared before the judge for sentencing. She spoke to the court about her bitter divorce and custody battle, her struggles with depression, and described herself as a broken person. She asked for leniency, hoping the judge might grant a reduced sentence considering her emotional distress. But her pleas didn't sway the judge. Prosecutor Steve Chaikin argued forcefully for the maximum penalty, asserting that the murder was premeditated and calculated. Not an impulsive or desperate act, but a carefully planned killing. The prosecution detailed how Nargis had poisoned her son, waited for his death, obtained gasoline to set the fire, and fabricated a story of an accidental overdose to hide her crime. On February 27, 2017, the judge sentenced Nargis Shafaya to 50 years in prison. This sentence meant she would spend most of her remaining life incarcerated in a Maryland facility for intentionally murdering her own child. The case of Nargis Shafaya and 5-year-old Daniel Dana stands as one of Maryland's most appalling instances of child abuse and filicide in recent memory. It serves as a grim example of how a custody battle can escalate into something unimaginable, how a parent's drive to maintain control over a child can transform into homicidal rage when that control is threatened. Daniel was 5 years old, a child who depended on his mother to nurture him, protect him, and keep him safe. Instead, she poisoned him with an overdose of drugs and burned his body in a car to conceal her crime and prevent his father from gaining custody. The brutality of the murder, the intentional poisoning, the methodical acquisition of gasoline and setting of the fire, the detachment shown during police questioning, all combined to make this one of the most disturbing cases of filicide. For Hamdana, Daniel's father, the loss was immeasurable. He had fought for custody of his son, believing he could provide a better and safer life than what Narges offered. But before any custody hearing could take place, before he could present his case before a judge, his son was dead, murdered by his own mother in an act of vengeance. The custody battle, which had consumed so much of their family's finances and emotional energy, ended not with a court decision, but with the tragic death of a child and the mother's lifetime imprisonment. Currently, Narges Shafeha remains imprisoned in a Maryland correctional facility, serving her 50-year sentence for Daniel Dana's murder. Daniel's final resting place is where his remains were buried following the autopsy, serving as a memorial to a 5-year-old boy who was killed by the person he should have been able to trust without question. This case acts as a chilling warning about the dangers of custody battles that become obsessive, where the child is treated as a pawn in a struggle for power and revenge, rather than a precious individual needing love and protection. It demonstrates how family law disputes can spiral into deadly violence, how the legal system's involvement in custody matters may sometimes escalate rather than reduce tensions, and how vulnerable children remain even with lawyers, courts, and child protective services intended to ensure their safety. Daniel Dana deserved better. He deserved a childhood, a life, a future full of possibilities and hope. Instead, he was poisoned, burned, and laid to rest by a mother consumed by rage and a desire for revenge against his father. His death serves as a sorrowful reminder of the absolute power parents hold over their children and the catastrophic consequences that can result when that power is wielded with malice instead of love. Story 8. On Christmas Eve of 2013, Chicago was wrapped in the familiar mix of excitement and cold that marks the holiday season in the Midwest. Throughout the city, families were gathering for celebrations, finishing last-minute gift wrapping, and preparing for Christmas Day. But in a basement apartment on North Kildare Avenue in the Belmont Gardens, neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side, an entirely different kind of anticipation was building. One destined to turn what should have been a joyful holiday into an unimaginable nightmare. This apartment was home to 3 people: a woman, her boyfriend Sylvester Diaz Hernandez, and her nephew, Alexis Valdez. Sylvester, known by that name to friends and acquaintances, was 41 years old and had built a life with his girlfriend in their modest shared home. 6 months earlier, they had taken in Alexis, the woman's 18-year-old nephew, who needed a place to stay. The arrangement had been made with explicit conditions. Alexis was supposed to work, attend school, and contribute to household expenses. At first, the living situation worked reasonably well, but over time, the carefully set terms of Alexis's stay began to fall apart. The young man stopped working, didn't contribute financially, and seemed to disregard all the responsibilities that were central to his aunt's generosity. Arguments over money and duties became more frequent, with each conflict escalating the tension. By December, Sylvester and Alexis's aunt had run out of patience. They told the 18-year-old that he needed to leave the apartment. For many young people, such news might be disappointing or awkward, but ultimately a manageable challenge requiring new arrangements. For Alexis Valdez, though, the demand to leave ignited something far more sinister. Instead of facing the consequences of his failure to meet the living arrangement's terms, Alexis became consumed with fury. His rage focused on Sylvester Diaz Hernandez, the man living with his aunt, who had initially welcomed him into the home and now agreed that Alexis should go. By Christmas Eve 2013, Alexis was overwhelmed with anger, his thoughts turning violent. Sometime during the night, between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, while most of Chicago slept peacefully awaiting holiday joy, Alexis Valdez decided to murder Sylvester Diaz Hernandez. The attack was savage and calculated. Alexis used a hammer to strike Sylvester repeatedly in the head. He hit the 41-year-old so many times and with such force that he fractured his skull. To mask the noise of the assault, Alexis played music at loud volume throughout. He also covered the apartment's windows to block any view from outside of what was happening inside. These weren't the actions of someone in a fit of uncontrolled rage, but deliberate steps by a person who knew he was committing murder and wanted to carry it out undisturbed. But the murder itself was just the beginning of the horror. What Alexis Valdez did after Sylvester died would shock even seasoned law enforcement officers and prosecutors familiar with countless violent crimes. In a gruesome act of mutilation, Alexis beheaded Sylvester's body. He removed the victim's ears and nose, extracted his eyes, and severed his left arm. The level of dismemberment and disfigurement went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. It revealed a depth of rage so intense it rendered a human being unrecognizable. Then Alexis carried Sylvester's severed head into his aunt's bedroom and placed it on her bed, a gift intended for her to discover when she returned home on Christmas Day, her boyfriend's head waiting for her. This act of calculated cruelty indicated not just anger over eviction, but an intent to inflict severe psychological trauma on the woman who had taken him in. After arranging his aunt's grisly gift and leaving Sylvester Diaz Hernandez's mutilated remains in the apartment, Alexis Valdez called 911 on Christmas morning, December 25, 2013, reporting a dead person. The conversation that followed gave investigators a glimpse into Alexis's state of mind immediately after the killing. When asked by the emergency dispatcher if he had attempted CPR on the victim, he laughed and replied it would be impossible because of the decapitation. His laughter and casual admission revealing a disturbing lack of remorse or understanding of his actions' severity. For Alexis, the situation seemed more amusing than horrifying. Chicago police responded to the emergency call and arrived at the basement unit on North Kildare Avenue, where they encountered a scene that would haunt them. Inside lay the decapitated and mutilated remains of Sylvester Diaz Hernandez. His severed head was positioned on the bed in the aunt's room. The space was saturated with blood, and in the middle of the devastation stood 18-year-old Alexis Valdez, covered in blood from head to toe. Valdez offered no resistance when arrested. In fact, he immediately confessed to killing Sylvester. But his statements to police would reveal an even more disturbing dimension of the crime. As Assistant State's Attorney Kingsley Sawyer, who would later present the evidence at Valdez's bond hearing, reported, the young man told authorities that if his aunt had come home and seen the victim's body, he would have killed her too. The message was clear. Alexis was prepared to commit a second murder if circumstances had called for it. His fury was directed not only at Sylvester, but also at his aunt, who had taken him in and eventually decided he needed to leave. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an autopsy and determined that Sylvester Diaz Hernandez died from multiple blunt and sharp force injuries. While officials didn't publicly disclose whether the decapitation occurred before or after Sylvester's death, the autopsy findings confirmed what the crime scene had already shown. This had been an exceptionally brutal assault involving both blunt trauma from a hammer and cutting wounds from a blade. Alexis Valdez was arrested immediately and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder. On Friday, December 27, 2013, he appeared before a judge for a bond hearing where prosecutors laid out the horrifying details of his actions. Assistant State's Attorney Kingsley Sawyer described the murder, the mutilation, the placement of Sylvester's head on his aunt's bed, and Alexis's stated intention to kill his aunt if she had returned home. After reviewing the evidence and recognizing the severe threat Valdez posed, the judge ordered him held without bail. There would be no possibility of release while he awaited trial. The incident sent shockwaves through Chicago and beyond. The brutality of the killing, the premeditated nature of the attack, the mutilation of the body, and the twisted logic behind leaving the victim's head as a Christmas gift, all combined to create a story that seemed almost incomprehensible. Media outlets nationwide covered the story, detailing the Christmas Day atrocity. The public struggled to understand what could drive a teenager to commit such a horrific act. What psychological factors or conditions could explain violence of this magnitude? For Sylvester Diaz, Hernandez's family and friends, the grief was immeasurably crushing. He had been killed in his own home, a place where he should have been safe, by someone he had tried to help. He had welcomed his girlfriend's nephew into his home, agreed to give the young man an opportunity to work and study, and ultimately paid with his life for that kindness in the most barbaric way possible. The fact that he was murdered on Christmas, a day meant for joy and family gatherings, added an even more unbearable layer to an already intolerable loss. For Alexis's aunt, the emotional trauma must have been beyond comprehension. She had tried to help her nephew by offering him accommodation when he needed it, when his failure to meet basic obligations made it impossible for him to stay longer. She and Sylvester had told him he needed to move out. That reasonable request sparked a murderous rage that took her boyfriend's life and was deliberately designed to cause her profound anguish. Learning that Alexis had also planned to kill her if she had arrived home at the wrong moment must have magnified her terror and grief. As the legal proceedings moved through the judicial system, Alexis Valdez remained incarcerated, facing a first-degree murder charge that could result in decades behind bars. Prosecutors had an overwhelming case: Valdez's own confession, physical evidence from the scene, the 911 call where he laughed about beheading someone, and statements from officers who found him blood-soaked amid the destruction. More than 3 years after the Christmas Day murder, on February 3, 2017, Alexis Valdez appeared before Cook County Judge Vincent Gaughan. He was now 21 years old, having spent his late teens and early adulthood detained awaiting his case's outcome. Instead of going to trial, Valdez pleaded guilty to murder. By acknowledging responsibility for the crime, he avoided the potentially harsher sentence a trial conviction might have brought. On Friday, February 3, 2017, Judge Gaughan sentenced Alexis Valdez to 33 years in prison. The sentence reflected the crime's extreme cruelty, the premeditated nature of the attack, and the total absence of mitigating factors that could warrant mercy. Valdez had murdered someone who had offered him shelter, mutilated the body in a horrifying manner, and staged the crime scene to cause maximum emotional distress to his aunt. The 33-year prison term ensured that Valdez would spend most of his adult years incarcerated, with no possibility of parole until he reached late middle age. The Chicago Sun-Times covered the sentencing, reminding readers of the details of the incident that had shocked the city over 3 years earlier. The article detailed how Valdez had attacked Sylvester with a hammer after being asked to leave the apartment, how he had beheaded and dismembered the victim, and how he had called 911 to confess his actions. The story served as a somber reminder of the Christmas Day atrocity and its final resolution in a lengthy prison sentence. The murder of Sylvester Diaz Hernandez remains among the most disturbing cases of domestic violence in Chicago's recent history. While domestic violence typically involves intimate partners, it can also encompass acts between family members or housemates. This case clearly falls under that broader definition. Alexis Valdez had been welcomed into a home, given clear guidelines about his responsibilities, and had failed to meet them. Faced with the logical consequence of being told to leave, he responded with murderous fury. The case also raised questions about warning signs, and whether anything could have prevented the tragedy. Were there signs of violent behavior from Alexis before the killing? Had there been threatening actions or escalating behavior that might have warned his aunt and Sylvester of the danger? Public records don't offer clear answers to these questions, but the premeditated nature of the crime, playing loud music to drown out noise, covering windows, systematically mutilating the body, suggests that Alexis was capable of planning and executing a sophisticated violent act. For law enforcement personnel, prosecutors and coroner's office staff involved in the investigation, the scene at the North Kildare Avenue apartment stood as one of the most unsettling crime scenes they had ever encountered. The intensity of the violence, the desecration of the body, and the casual demeanor displayed by the perpetrator created a case that would stay with them long after Valdez began his sentence. The fact that the murder occurred on Christmas gave the case a particularly tragic dimension. Sylvester Diaz Hernandez lost his life on a day meant for happiness, killed by someone his partner had tried to help. For his family, Christmas would forever be linked to his brutal murder, an indelible stain on a holiday meant for joy and togetherness. The image of his severed head, placed on a bed as a twisted gift, represented a perversion of everything Christmas is supposed to embody. Currently, Alexis Valdez remains confined in the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving his 33-year sentence for killing Sylvester Diaz Hernandez. He won't be eligible for release until well past age 50, having been imprisoned during the prime years of his life for a crime that horrified even experienced criminal justice professionals. The sentence ensures that the public is protected from him for decades, preventing him from harming others as he did Sylvester. But no sentence, regardless of its length, can undo what happened on Christmas Day 2013. Sylvester Diaz Hernandez, a 41-year-old man who had tried to help his girlfriend's nephew, was brutally murdered and dismembered in his own home. His life was ended by someone he had welcomed into his space, someone to whom he had given an opportunity to improve his situation. The kindness he and his girlfriend showed Alexis Valdez ultimately led to Sylvester's death in the most terrifying way possible. This case stands as a harsh warning that violence can emerge in any setting, that helping those in need may sometimes carry unexpected risks, and that human capacity for brutality can manifest in nearly unimaginable ways. Sylvester Diaz Hernandez deserved a better fate. He deserved to celebrate Christmas with his partner, to continue building his life in Chicago, to grow old peacefully. Instead, he became victim to one of the city's most macabre murders, killed by a young man who answered a call to responsibility with deliberate and extreme violence. His memory deserves to be honored, his death should be mourned, and his story should be preserved, both as a tragedy and as a warning about the latent violence that can hide behind seemingly ordinary household disputes. Story 9. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 2nd, 2018, the countryside of Kershaw County, South Carolina, lay quiet and shadowed along Cleveland School Road, a winding path that passed agricultural fields and isolated homes. Nearly everyone was sound asleep at 2:30 a.m. But at the Kershaw County 911 call center, an incoming phone call was about to set in motion a tragic saga that would span nearly 7 years, cross multiple states, and reveal a story of domestic violence, deception, and delayed justice. The caller was an older man from New York, his voice heavy with anguish and shock. He told the operator that his son had just phoned him with a terrifying confession. He had shot his girlfriend and was now considering ending his own life. The father gave the address of his son's home in Kershaw County. Within moments, sheriff's deputies and patrol units were racing through the night toward Cleveland School Road. Their discovery upon arrival would mark the beginning of one of the most alarming domestic violence cases to emerge in the area. A case that would later involve fugitive alerts, aliases, an FBI manhunt, and questions about how the legal system could allow a suspected murderer to disappear for over 6 years. When law enforcement arrived at the Cleveland School Road home just after 2:30 that morning, they immediately spotted 28-year-old Alexander Francis Harmon sitting on the front porch. The scene was bizarre and eerie in its ordinariness. Harmon was eating potato chips, smoking cigarettes, and drinking a beer as though he were simply having a late-night snack rather than sitting steps away from where his girlfriend's body lay dead. Deputies approached cautiously, uncertain how to deal with someone who had allegedly just committed a murder and expressed suicidal thoughts. But Harmon didn't try to flee or resist them. Instead, he calmly told the officers that his girlfriend was dead inside the house. The unemotional, matter-of-fact way he delivered this information would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, a glimpse into the psychology of a man who had just taken a life and seemed to feel minimal remorse or emotional disturbance. Officers entered the home and found 19-year-old Caitlin Jordan Crocker inside. She had suffered a gunshot wound to the head from a 12-gauge shotgun, and it was clear she had died. The scene was processed according to standard procedures, with detectives requesting support from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division to help document and analyze the evidence. Inside the house, they located the murder weapon, a 12-gauge shotgun, plus a spent shell that confirmed the firearm had been fired shortly before. One patrol officer had been wearing a body camera during the initial encounter with Harmon, and this footage would become crucial to the investigation. The recording showed Harmon confessing that he had shot Caitlin Crocker. It was an admission delivered with the same unsettling calm he had displayed on the porch, a piece of evidence that would later help secure his conviction years down the line. Harmon was arrested at the scene and taken to the Kershaw County Detention Center, where he was questioned by investigators. During that conversation, his story began to shift. Instead of maintaining his initial acknowledgement of responsibility, Harmon now claimed that Caitlin had been holding the shotgun initially. In this revised version, the gun had gone off accidentally while they were struggling, suggesting the shooting was unintentional rather than deliberate. This claim would become central to his defense strategy, though law enforcement and prosecutors would ultimately reject it as a self-protective lie meant to minimize his culpability. Harmon was formally charged with murder and held without bond awaiting his first court hearings. Kershaw County Chief Deputy Jack Rushing shared case details with media outlets, and locals began learning about the victim whose life had been so brutally cut short. Caitlin Jordan Crocker was only 19 years old at her death, a young woman with her entire future ahead of her. A native of Columbia, South Carolina, she was the daughter of Harold Ray Crocker and Jonna Dixon Crocker. Caitlin had been raised in Winsboro and attended Fairfield Central High School, where she was an excellent student known for her academic achievements and bright prospects. She had graduated as an honors student, someone who had worked hard and excelled academically, earning recognition for her dedication and intelligence. Those who knew Caitlin remembered her as a person with potential, someone who should have been preparing for college or starting a career, building a life full of opportunity and hope. Instead, she had become involved with Alexander Harmon, a man 9 years her senior, and that connection ended in the most terrible way possible. According to investigators, Caitlin had occasionally lived with Harmon, indicating a relationship that may have been volatile or intermittent. The details of their bond and the trigger for the fatal argument on that June night would be intensely scrutinized as the investigation progressed. For Caitlin's family, the news of her death was immeasurably heartbreaking. Her immediate and extended family were forced to face the sudden, violent loss of a beloved daughter who had been alive just hours before. The funeral arrangements and obituary described a young woman deeply mourned by her loved ones and community, someone whose promise would remain unfulfilled, whose dreams would never materialize. The early stages of the investigation seemed straightforward. Harmon had confessed to the shooting both to his father and to police at the scene. The body camera footage provided clear evidence of his admission. The physical evidence, the gun, the spent shell, Caitlin's body, all supported the conclusion that Harmon was responsible for her death. Prosecutors seemed to have a strong case, and it appeared justice would be delivered relatively quickly. But the case then took a turn that would delay justice for over 6 years and transform a murder investigation into a multi-state hunt for a fugitive. On November 16, 2018, merely 5 months after Caitlin's death, a circuit court judge made a decision with disastrous consequences. Despite the seriousness of the charges and the strength of the evidence, the judge granted Alexander Harmon a $150,000 bond. That same day, Harmon posted the bond and was released from custody. Shortly afterward, he completely disappeared from South Carolina, abandoning the murder charge, the upcoming trial, and any accountability for his actions toward Caitlin Crocker. For Caitlin's family, this development must have been agonizing. The man responsible for their daughter's death was now on the run, his whereabouts unknown, continuing with his life while Caitlin lay in her grave. What happened next revealed a level of premeditation and deception that went beyond the original crime. Instead of simply hiding or trying to live quietly, Harmon created a completely new identity. He adopted the alias Sean Daldry and used this false name to obtain official documents, insurance policies, and vehicle registration. He wasn't just evading capture. He was constructing a new life complete with legitimate paperwork that allowed him to move through society undetected. For more than 6 years, Alexander Harmon effectively lived as Sean Daldry, maintaining his fabricated identity as authorities searched for him. He crossed state lines, settled in new locations, and continuously avoided arrest despite being wanted for murder. It represented a shocking breakdown in the judicial process, a case where bail had been granted to someone who clearly posed a flight risk and whose decision to flee was validated by his ability to remain hidden for such an extended period. But in December 2024, a break in the case finally emerged, though from an unexpected and deeply troubling source. The FBI discovered that a man using the name Sean Daldry was in contact with a 15-year-old who had run away from home in Florida. The nature of these communications raised immediate concerns, suggesting that Harmon might be targeting a vulnerable teen. Federal agents immediately began surveillance on Daldry's activities, determined to identify him and intervene before circumstances could deteriorate. The pursuit led them to Council Bluffs, Iowa, a city on the Missouri River in the western part of the state, far from South Carolina, where Harmon was wanted. Federal agents located him at a hotel and moved to take him into custody. Harmon attempted to flee, leading to a brief chase before agents finally captured him. When law enforcement took his fingerprints, the truth was finally confirmed. Sean Daldry was indeed Alexander Francis Harmon, the fugitive from South Carolina who had been evading capture since 2018. The man who had murdered Caitlin Crocker and then vanished under an assumed name had finally been caught. In January 2025, Harmon was extradited back to South Carolina to face the murder charge that had been pending against him for nearly 7 years. The revelation that Harmon had been communicating with a teenage runaway added another disturbing layer to the case. It suggested that his violence toward Caitlin might not have been an isolated incident, and that he could pose a threat to other vulnerable people, especially young women. While the specific details and content of those communications weren't publicly disclosed, their prompting of FBI involvement indicated serious concerns about Harmon's intentions and behavior. Following his extradition, the wheels of justice finally began turning in earnest. The Fifth Judicial Circuit Solicitor's Office prepared to prosecute the case, with Senior Assistant Solicitor Dale Scott and Assistant Solicitor Michael Bradbury leading the prosecution. They had strong evidence, including Harmon's recorded confession at the crime scene, physical evidence from the incident, and testimony from investigators who had handled the case from the beginning. In September 2025, over 7 years after Caitlin's death, the trial began. A jury in Kershaw County heard the case presented by the prosecution, which detailed the horrific events of that June morning in 2018. Harmon's confession, captured on body camera, and forensic evidence that contradicted his claim of an accidental discharge during a struggle. Harmon's legal team presented his version of events, suggesting that Caitlin had initially held the shotgun and went off accidentally. But the jurors didn't believe this story. On September 17, 2025, after reviewing the facts, they reached a verdict. Alexander Francis Harmon was found guilty of murder. The verdict brought some measure of closure for Caitlin Crocker and her family, though it couldn't reverse the tragedy of her loss or compensate for the prolonged delay. While Harmon had been on the run under an assumed name, Circuit Judge Heath P. Taylor presided over the sentencing phase. Considering the severity of the crime and its context, including Harmon's flight from law enforcement and his years as a fugitive, the judge imposed the maximum penalty. Alexander Harmon received a life sentence without the possibility of parole in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. He would remain in prison for life, permanently stripped of freedom and unable to harm anyone else. For Harold and Jonna Crocker, Caitlin's parents, the guilty verdict and sentence marked the end of a difficult journey through the legal system. Their daughter had been violently taken from them by someone she had trusted and lived with. They then endured the added torment of watching her killer escape and live undetected for over 6 years, with justice seeming elusive. His capture only after he was suspected of targeting another young person likely brought both relief and additional grief. Realizing his threat continued beyond Caitlin's death. This case prompted critical examination of the bail process and judicial decisions on bond in violent felony cases. Harmon faced a murder charge, among the most serious offenses. Yet a judge deemed a monetary bond sufficient to secure his court appearance, a judgment that proved disastrously wrong. Harmon not only fled, but also created an elaborate alias and evaded capture for over 6 years. During this time, Caitlin's family was denied closure, and Harmon remained free to potentially endanger others. The case also highlighted the complexities and challenges in domestic violence incidents, especially those involving younger victims and older partners. Caitlin was just 19 years old when Harmon, then 28, killed her. The 9-year age gap, combined with their intermittent living arrangement, suggested a relationship possibly marked by control dynamics and unpredictability. According to authorities, Harmon's father revealed that his son had admitted to shooting Caitlin after an argument. This detail underscored how domestic violence deaths often stem from disputes that turn lethal, with women especially vulnerable to intimate partners. Harmon's lack of prior criminal record likely influenced the judge's bond decision. But no documented criminal history didn't equate to being non-dangerous, a fact tragically demonstrated on June 2, 2018. This case illustrates that domestic abusers often have no prior arrests, especially if victims fear reporting, or if violence remains hidden from public view. The Kershaw County Sheriff's Office investigation, led by Chief Deputy Jack Rushing and colleagues, was thorough and competent. They gathered compelling evidence, properly documented the scene, and built a case that led to a conviction. However, even excellent police work couldn't prevent the 6-year delay in justice caused by Harmon's escape and successful hiding. FBI intervention, prompted by concerns over his contact with a minor, was necessary to finally bring him to justice. When the verdict and sentence were announced in September 2025, regional media reported on the case's conclusion, reminding the public of the young honors student from Fairfield Central High School, whose life was stolen 7 years earlier. Caitlin Jordan Crocker will always be remembered as 19, her possibilities unrealized, her dreams unmet. But her attacker is permanently confined, unable to roam free again or assume another identity or prey on vulnerable young people anymore. This case serves as evidence of the determined dedication of police and legal authorities who refused to let the investigation go cold, who continued pursuing Harmon despite the passage of time, and who ultimately secured his conviction once he was captured. It equally serves as a stark warning about the lethal nature of domestic violence, the importance of recognizing red flags in relationships, and the urgent need for the judicial system to treat violent crimes with gravity from initial arrest through trial. Caitlin Crocker's life mattered. Her murder was more than just a statistic in the tragic count of domestic violence deaths. She was a person with family and friends who loved her, achievements she had earned, and a bright future ahead. The prolonged evasion of justice by her killer compounded the tragedy of her loss. But the final guilty verdict and life sentence ensured that Alexander Harmon would answer for taking her life. Ultimately, while justice was delayed, it was not denied, and Caitlin's legacy was honored through a jury's decision that affirmed the value of her life and the severity of the crime committed against her. Story 10. The late evening hours at the Eye, Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in northwest Austin, were winding down as the time approached 11 p.m. On December 6, 1991. The small retail space was located in a strip mall on Anderson Lane, a busy thoroughfare where families shopped and teenagers hung out on Friday nights. Inside, two 17-year-old employees, Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, were preparing to close up for the night. They had spent their shift working side by side, scooping frozen yogurt for the steady stream of customers that typically increased on Fridays. Waiting for them to finish were Jennifer's younger sister, 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, and Sarah's friend, 13-year-old Amy Ayers. The two teens had come to the shop earlier that evening, planning to catch a ride home with Jennifer after her shift ended at 11. It was a routine arrangement for young siblings, one of those ordinary facts that family members would later remember with painful clarity. Sarah and Amy sat inside the store, probably talking about school or their weekend plans, watching Jennifer and Eliza clean up and prepare to lock the doors. Not one of them could have known that these moments would be their last. None were aware that someone was watching, waiting, planning something horrific. Just before midnight, an Austin Police Department officer noticed smoke coming from the yogurt shop and called it in. As fire crews rushed to the scene and began fighting the blaze, they had no idea of the horror waiting inside. Once firefighters had extinguished the fire and entered, they discovered something that would haunt Austin for decades. 4 dead bodies were found inside the smoke-stained shop. All 4 victims were teenage girls. All were unclothed, and each had been shot in the head. 3 of them, Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer, had been bound and gagged using their own undergarments. The brutality was overwhelming. Each girl had been killed with a .22 caliber gunshot to the head. Amy had also been shot with a .380 caliber handgun. 3 of the bodies were severely burned from the deliberately set fire meant to destroy evidence. There were signs of sexual assault. The scene depicted a terrifying sequence of events. The perpetrator or perpetrators had either entered the shop just before closing or stayed hidden until no other customers remained. They forced the 4 girls to undress, tied up 3 with their own clothing, and inflicted horrific violence upon them before shooting each in the head. Then, in a deliberate attempt to erase evidence, they set the building on fire. The murders shocked Austin, a city that prided itself on its reputation as a safe, progressive university town. This was 1991, when mass shootings and brutal crimes targeting children weren't yet as common as they would become in later years. Quickly dubbed the yogurt shop murders, they represented a level of evil the area had never before witnessed. 4 innocent girls aged 13 to 17 had been terrorized, assaulted, and killed in a place that should have been safe, in a neighborhood full of families and young people. Barbara Harbison, mother of Jennifer and Sarah, would spend the next 30 years asking who had taken her daughters' lives and why. Eliza's and Amy's families shared in a grief so profound it felt unbearable. These weren't just casualties. They were beloved daughters, sisters, friends, students with bright futures ahead of them. Jennifer and Eliza had been reliable employees trusted to close the shop by themselves. Sarah and Amy were young girls excited about a Friday night, looking forward to the weekend ahead. Suddenly, all their potential was gone. The investigation began immediately, with Austin police dedicating vast resources to the case. Detectives canvassed the area, spoke with potential witnesses, and collected whatever physical evidence remained from the fire-damaged scene. But deliberate arson had destroyed much of the forensic evidence that could have quickly pointed to the culprit. The case that would become one of Austin's most tragic and enduring mysteries had begun. For 8 long years, these murders remained unsolved. Investigators followed up on countless tips, questioned innumerable people of interest, and worked tirelessly to achieve justice for 4 murdered girls. The investigation consumed the Austin Police Department's attention and troubled the city deeply. Vigils were held, rewards were posted, but no suspects were arrested, leaving the victims' families in an agonizing limbo without answers or closure. Then, in 1999, things shifted dramatically. 8 years after the murders, authorities arrested 4 young men: Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. All 4 had been teenagers when the murders occurred. 2 of them, Scott and Springsteen, confessed following lengthy interrogation sessions. For the families and community, it seemed that justice had finally been served. After 8 years of waiting and uncertainty, law enforcement had identified the perpetrators. But this sense of relief would prove short-lived, as the confessions revealed a disturbing chapter in the history of wrongful convictions. The questioning that led to these confessions was intense and coercive. During marathon interrogation sessions, police yelled and used profanity toward the young suspects. Later accounts indicated that an officer once pressed a gun to a suspect's head. While the confessions included details about the murders, they were also riddled with contradictions and errors that should have raised red flags. For instance, in his statement, Michael Scott claimed that the attackers had accessed the yogurt shop's office during the incident. But when police arrived at the scene, that door was locked from inside, requiring a key for entry. The scenario Scott described was physically impossible. Similar inconsistencies appeared in both confessions, with elements that conflicted with forensic evidence or the crime scene's condition. Despite these problems, prosecutors Ron Lara, Darla Davis, and Buddy Jones proceeded with the prosecutions. They were confident in having 2 recorded confessions, though they knew they needed concrete evidence to support these accounts. Ultimately, charges were dropped against Pierce and Wellborn, who had never confessed. But Scott and Springsteen, the 2 who had confessed, went to trial. Each was convicted of capital murder in separate trials. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death, while Michael Scott received a life sentence. It appeared justice had been achieved, allowing the 4 girls to rest in peace and their families to begin healing. But the story was far from over. Both convictions were appealed and later overturned due to legal errors during the trials. As preparations for new trials began, advances in DNA science brought a startling discovery. DNA evidence recovered from one victim didn't match any of the 4 arrested men. The genetic material pointed to a completely different person. In 1929, prosecutors reluctantly decided to release both Springsteen and Scott Dawkeye. One man had been on death row, and another had spent years imprisoned for crimes they likely didn't commit. The yogurt shop investigation reverted to square one, unsolved and seemingly beyond solution. Once again, the families were heartbroken, forced to accept that the justice they believed they had obtained was an illusion. The Travis County District Attorney later acknowledged the grave error. The preponderance of evidence suggests one man's guilt and 4 men's innocence. A spokesperson for the office said about the exonerated men, "If the investigation's results are confirmed, the Travis County District Attorney's Office will take responsibility for its role in prosecuting these men, sending one to death row and one to life in prison." For another 16 years, the case remained cold. The DNA evidence was kept in storage until technological advances could pinpoint its source. Detectives continued their efforts, but leads dried up and the investigation stalled. Families marked anniversaries and birthdays, forever wondering if they would ever learn the truth about that terrible December night in 1991. Then in 2025, 3 decades after the killings, came the long-awaited breakthrough. Improvements in DNA testing and forensic genealogy, combined with a fresh examination of ballistic evidence, led investigators to a name: Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers was no stranger to authorities. Born on March 13, 1958, he had accumulated an extensive criminal history, including attempted murder, burglary, and impersonating a police officer. More significantly, DNA had linked him to a series of violent crimes across multiple states, marking him as a serial rapist and killer of extreme cruelty. The investigation revealed a nearly decade-long pattern of violence. In 1990, Brashers was connected to the rape and murder of Genevieve Zitricki, a 28-year-old found beaten and strangled in her Greenville, South Carolina bathroom. In March 1997, he raped a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee, after breaking into a home with a gun and restraining its occupants. And in 1998, he murdered Sherry and Megan Scherer, a 38-year-old woman and her 12-year-old daughter in Portageville, Missouri, sexually assaulting the girl before killing them both. The timeline was chilling. The yogurt shop murders occurred in December 1991, fitting perfectly into Brasher's escalating violent behavior. His modus operandi matched the crime. He frequently used firearms, restrained his victims, and on one occasion, held multiple captives at once. The DNA recovered from one yogurt shop victim matched Brasher's genetic profile. On Monday, September 29, 2025, Austin police held a press conference to announce their findings. Detective Daniel Jackson, who led the investigation, detailed the probe and explained how cutting-edge DNA testing had finally solved the crime. The victims' families were present, their faces showing a mix of relief, sorrow, and exhaustion. Barbara Harbison, whose 2 daughters were taken from her that night in 1991, spoke of the many years of waiting for answers. "It's been an incredibly long time, and all we ever wanted was the truth about what happened," she said with deep emotion. Other family members echoed her sentiments, grateful that the puzzle had finally been solved, yet permanently scarred by the tragedy they had endured. But there was a heartbreaking addendum to the news. Robert Eugene Brashers would never stand trial for the yogurt shop murders. He had died in 1999, just 8 years after the crimes, in a confrontation with police in Missouri. On January 19, 1999, officers had approached Brashers, and instead of surrendering, he took his own life with a gunshot. He was 40 years old when he died. The timing was grimly ironic. Brashers ended his life in the same year that 4 innocent people were being arrested and questioned for his actions. While Scott and Springsteen were undergoing coercive interrogation and giving false confessions under pressure, the real murderers committing suicide, taking his secrets with him. While Pierce and Wellborn were in custody as suspects, Brashers was escaping justice permanently. At the September 2025 press conference, Detective Jackson emphasized that the investigation remained active. While compelling evidence pointed to Brashers as the perpetrator, detectives were pursuing additional leads and looking into possible accomplices. Jackson also mentioned that Brashers might be connected to other unsolved murders, suggesting that the full scope of his criminal acts may never be known. The case also raised serious questions about the justice system and the reliability of confession-based evidence. The false confessions that led to 2 innocent men's imprisonment, one sentenced to death, stemmed from aggressive interrogation techniques, now widely recognized as likely to produce unreliable statements. The yogurt shop case became emblematic of a broader pattern of wrongful convictions linked to coerced confessions, joining countless instances where innocent people were jailed for crimes they didn't commit. The detectives working the case in 1999 faced enormous pressure to solve one of Austin's most notorious crimes. They genuinely believed they had found the right people and built cases against them. But, in their eagerness to provide answers to the families, they made terrible mistakes. The confessions they obtained lacked supporting forensic evidence, and contradictions should have served as warning signs. Instead, 4 young men had their lives disrupted, and the real perpetrator remained free to continue his violent rampage. For the Harbison family, Jennifer and Sarah's loved ones, and for Eliza Thomas's and Amy Ayers' families, the 2025 revelation offered a bittersweet form of closure. After 3 decades of waiting, uncertainty, and yearning, they finally knew who had murdered their daughters and why. Robert Eugene Brashers was a serial predator who preyed on vulnerable victims without mercy. The girls had simply been unfortunate enough to cross paths with a predator who saw them as nothing but objects for his violence at a tragic moment. The yogurt shop murders stand as one of Austin's most traumatic criminal events. 4 young lives stolen in a brutal act that wounded a city and haunted investigators for over 3 decades. The case revealed weaknesses in the judicial process and led to wrongful convictions that imprisoned innocent people. It required advances in forensic technology and persistent efforts by cold case detectives to finally identify the killer long after he had escaped earthly justice. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers should have had futures. Graduating, falling in love, starting families of their own. Instead, they're remembered on memorials, victims of one of Texas's most infamous unsolved cases. Identifying Robert Eugene Brashers as their attacker has finally given their families the answers they sought for years, even if it cannot restore what was stolen that December night in 1991. Authorities continue investigating whether Brashers had accomplices or committed other unsolved crimes. But for Austin residents, the affected families, and all who followed this story across decades, the question haunting them since 1991 is now answered. Robert Eugene Brashers murdered 4 defenseless girls in a yogurt shop one December night. He was a serial killer whose violent career ended by suicide in 1999. Leaving behind destruction still being mapped out by law enforcement today. Austin will always remember the yogurt shop murders. This case underscores how fragile life can be, the critical importance of justice, and the essential need for investigations to be accurate from the start. 4 young women lost their lives that evening. Innocent people were wrongfully convicted, and a serial murderer evaded accountability by taking his own life. The tragedy is deepened by multiple layers of injustice and grief that reach far beyond that burning yogurt shop 33 years ago. But, at long last, the families know the truth. And perhaps within that truth, they can find some measure of peace. Story 11. In the quiet industrial town of Yamagasaki in Hyōgo Prefecture, Japan, a terrifying story had been unfolding for over a quarter century that would defy understanding and expose the darkest extremes of human exploitation and cruelty. This was a crime so complex, so perverse, and so difficult to comprehend that even experienced detectives struggled to grasp how a single woman could orchestrate years of systematic abuse, torture, and murder spanning multiple families and regions. The story began in the late 1980s when Miyuki Sumida, a woman later dubbed the Piranha, started seeking out vulnerable families to entangle in her web of deception and control. Miyuki Sumida came from a life marked by poverty and hardship. Raised in harsh conditions, she quickly learned the art of detecting weaknesses in people and exploiting them for personal gain. By middle age, she had developed a predatory mindset. Find a family facing financial difficulty, earn their trust through calculated kindness, position herself as essential to them, and then systematically strip them of their assets, freedom, and eventually their lives. For more than 20 years, she repeated this pattern again and again, leaving behind a trail of bodies buried in concrete, stuffed in oil drums, and hidden underground. The first recorded death occurred in 1987, though the exact details of her death remain unclear, as Sumida herself took much of the truth to her grave. But by the late 1990s, Sumida's predatory cycle had become firmly established, and the suffering of her victims would become increasingly documented and horrific. The Iuchi family became one of Sumida's most extensively documented cases. Through their suffering, authorities would ultimately decipher her method of operation. Sumida had loaned money to the Iuchi family's youngest son, a man in desperate need of financial support. Gradually, she converted the debt into a state of bondage, slowly seizing the family's assets, property, and home through a combination of fraud and coercion. What Sumida had begun as a financial arrangement evolved into complete domination, with every family member falling under her control. But Sumida's genius, if such a word can describe evil, lay in her understanding of human psychology and family dynamics. Instead of simply subjugating family members through direct violence, she implemented a far more refined and destructive approach. She forced family members to hurt each other. She created scenarios where children assaulted their mothers, where siblings turned against each other, where parents endured violence from their own children. In this way, she wove a psychological trap so elaborate that family members lost the ability to trust each other or unite against her, trapped in a nightmare where their closest relatives had become instruments of their suffering. The Iuchi family endured severe deprivation. Drinking water was limited to half a liter daily. Bathroom access was restricted to twice per day. Food was insufficient and controlled. Family members were forced to work without pay, their labor generating income that went straight to Sumida. They were isolated from society, cut off from any chance of getting help or escaping. Within this hellish environment, Sumida established an abuse hierarchy. Those she deemed less useful or obedient suffered the worst treatment. An elderly woman named Kazuko Oi, whom Sumida had placed at the bottom of the family's pecking order, experienced the most intense abuse. In 1999, after years of confinement, torture, starvation, and psychological conditioning, Kazuko Oi died. The cause was injuries and abuse so extreme that her body could no longer survive under such conditions. After Kazuko's death, the Iuchi family's eldest son, overwhelmed by guilt for the violence he had been forced to commit against his mother, and devastated by grief at her death, took his own life. The suicide represented an attempt to escape the nightmare Sumida had created, to achieve through death what he couldn't accomplish in life: freedom from her control and release from the shame of having been used as an instrument in his mother's suffering. But Sumida didn't simply release the surviving Iuchi family members after draining everything she could from them. She legally adopted the remaining children and subjected them to intensive psychological manipulation designed to erase their memories of their birth parents and original family identity. She tried to implant in them hatred toward the parents they had lost, rewriting their personal histories and replacing their family bonds with loyalty solely to her. It was a form of psychological annihilation as complete as any physical harm, an attempt to create people whose only connection to reality was through Sumida herself. Over the years, as Sumida continued her crimes across different areas, her victim count grew. According to law enforcement estimates spanning roughly a quarter century, she was involved in the deaths of no fewer than 8 people, was responsible for at least 3 documented disappearances, and had inflicted torture, physical harm, and mental coercion on dozens of individuals. She had targeted at least 5 separate families. with the total number of those who suffered her cruelty across all incidents reaching approximately 28 people. Her approach remained fundamentally consistent, with adjustments made to suit each targeted family's particular circumstances. First, Sumita would identify a household facing financial hardship or a vulnerable individual. She initiated contact through seemingly harmless means, offering help with debts, providing accommodation, or extending care for an elderly relative. She earned their trust by showing kindness and support. Once embedded in the family's life, she began to strengthen her position, making herself indispensable and gradually dominating every aspect of their daily existence. The next step was isolation. Sumita would sever the family's connections to the outside world, preventing them from accessing help and stopping friends or relatives from discovering the situation. She restricted access to food, water, and even bathroom use, creating conditions of extreme deprivation that left family members weakened and dependent. Financial exploitation escalated as property titles were transferred to Sumita, bank accounts drained, and labor demanded without payment. Then came the psychological manipulation and orchestrated violence. By forcing family members to harm one another, Sumita built layers of guilt and shame that made it nearly impossible for victims to seek help. Who would believe them if they revealed that their own relatives had been coerced into torturing them? How could they explain that they had been forced to commit violent acts against those they loved? Sumita had devised a control system so advanced that it made outside intervention seem impossible and internal escape inconceivable. Her criminal activity went largely undetected for decades because each case was spread out geographically. Her victims were isolated and traumatized and fearful, and because the sheer outrageousness of her actions seemed unbelievable to police accustomed to more conventional crimes. But eventually, the truth of what had happened began to emerge. The investigation that would finally expose Miyuki Sumida began when detectives discovered 3 decomposing bodies in an abandoned home in Amagasaki in October 2012. The bodies were in an advanced state of decay, and the house had been empty for some time. Immediately, questions arose about their identities, how long they'd been dead, and what had happened to them. The probe expanded outward from those 3 remains, and as authorities began assembling the pieces, connections to Miyuki Sumida surfaced. Earlier incidents that had seemed separate or mysterious suddenly gained new meaning when viewed within the framework of Sumida's systematic exploitation. A woman's body found in a metal drum filled with concrete at a warehouse in Amagasaki in November 2011. A death previously examined as an isolated incident was now recognized as one of Sumida's murders. The deceased was believed to be Kazuko Oe, the elderly woman who had suffered years of abuse from the Ouchi family under Sumida's direction. In October 2012, 17 people were arrested and charged in connection with multiple killings, disappearances, and instances of assault and confinement. The number of suspects was unusually large for a single criminal case, reflecting the complex network of family relationships and the extent to which Sumida had manipulated numerous people into becoming accomplices in her crimes. Miyuki Sumida herself was arrested and held in police custody. The woman who had terrorized families for over 25 years, who had orchestrated the deaths of at least 8 people, who had destroyed households and incited relatives to commit violence against each other, was finally behind bars. At age 64, Sumida faced multiple charges related to assault, confinement, and murder. But the investigation was just beginning. Prosecutors needed to understand the full scope of Sumida's actions, to document every crime, track down each victim, and build cases strong enough to ensure justice would be served. It was extraordinarily complex work, made more challenging by many events having occurred years earlier. Witnesses were traumatized with fragmented memories. Some evidence had been destroyed or hidden. As authorities worked to build their case, they began realizing something else about Miyuki Sumida. She wasn't just a killer or a criminal in the traditional sense. She possessed an exceptional talent for manipulation, with a profound understanding of human psychology. She could identify the vulnerabilities that would break families apart and turn them into engines of self-destruction. She had weaponized love, duty, and family bonds, twisting these fundamental human connections into instruments of torture and control. But Sumita's story wasn't destined to unfold in a courtroom where justice could be fully documented and explained for public understanding. While in custody, she began communicating with lawyers and officers managing her detention, expressing severe depression and suicidal thoughts. "Life holds no meaning," she allegedly told them. "I want to die. How can I end my life?" she asked repeatedly. Sumita was placed on suicide watch, monitored constantly as authorities worried she might attempt to kill herself. But on December 12, 2012, despite these precautions, despite the presence of 2 other detainees in her cell, and despite ongoing surveillance, Miyuki Sumita succeeded. In her cell, hidden from public view, far from the courtroom where her victims' stories might have been heard, and removed from the judicial process that was beginning to understand the full extent of her crimes, she removed her long-sleeved shirt and tied it tightly around her neck. She strangled herself. Sumita's body was discovered the next day. An autopsy was conducted to determine if her death was self-inflicted or due to another cause. The findings confirmed death from asphyxiation caused by strangulation. Ultimately, Miyuki Sumita chose to end her own life rather than face trial and be convicted for the murders she had committed. The prime suspect's death posed major challenges for detectives trying to uncover the complete truth of the case. Without Sumita's testimony or explanations, it became considerably harder to reconstruct the exact events for each victim, understand the specific circumstances surrounding each death, and distinguish which crimes she personally committed from those carried out by her coerced accomplices. Much of what Sumita had orchestrated would remain only partially understood, a mystery with missing pieces that could never be fully recovered. For the victims' families, Sumita's suicide meant they would never see her held accountable for her actions, never watch her react when confronted with the magnitude of her wrongdoing, never hear a judge formally pronounce her guilt. Any form of closure was impossible. The person who had engineered their family's destruction, who had killed their loved ones, who had tortured them and forced them to harm each other, had escaped earthly justice by ending her own life. For the 17 people arrested in connection with the case, circumstances were more complicated. Some were victims who had been coerced into participating in criminal acts. Others were true partners in crime. The legal system would have to distinguish between them, establish appropriate levels of responsibility, and separate those who acted under duress from those who willingly participated in Sumita's depredations. The impact of Miyuki Sumita's crimes reaches beyond the 8 confirmed deaths and the 28 people who endured her abuse. Her case exposed the immense complexity of domestic violence, the sophisticated methods by which perpetrators can control multiple victims simultaneously, and the profound psychological damage that occurs when authority figures systematically dismantle family connections. She proved that murder and torture don't require weapons or physical strength. They can be accomplished through psychological coercion, domination, and the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. The Amagasaki serial murder case, as it was called in Japanese media, captivated a nation that prided itself on low crime rates and social stability. The case challenged core assumptions about safety and family trust. It revealed that evil doesn't always present itself obviously. Sometimes it comes disguised as a helper, a rescuer, a benefactor, sometimes nearly unstoppable until it has destroyed everything in its path. Miyuki Sumita died by suicide in a detention cell on December 12, 2012, taking a great deal of the truth about her misdeeds to her grave. She was never prosecuted, never officially sentenced, never publicly held accountable for the killings she had arranged. But her name has come to represent a new category of exploitation in Japan: the orchestration of domestic violence through psychological manipulation rather than brute force. Her legacy serves as a warning, a reminder that wickedness can operate undetected, that vulnerability marks people as prey, and that family relationships can be weaponized by someone skilled enough in deception and cruelty. The victims of the Yamagasaki case, both those who died under Sumita's control and those who survived the agony of her abuse, deserved more than a murderer who avoided trial through self-destruction. They were entitled to see justice served, to have their suffering acknowledged in a formal court process, to be assured that the person responsible for destroying their lives would face tangible consequences from society. Instead, they were given only fragmented explanations, a limited understanding of events, and a wound that would never completely heal. Miyuki Sumida was the architect of their suffering, and through her death, she ensured that their story would remain forever incomplete. Story 12. On a December day in 1980, beside a remote section of Nevada Highway near Majuba Canyon, a man whose thoughts were racing uncontrollably stood at the roadside hoping for a ride. His name was Mark James Robert Rogers. While he looked like any typical hitchhiker traveling between destinations, the workings of his mind were fractured and twisted by severe mental illness. In the moments leading up to this instant, and in the time that would follow, the world remained unaware of the tragedy about to unfold, the lives that would be brutally destroyed, and the legal failure that would define this case for years to come. David Hartshorn, employed as a geologist at the Majuba Hill mine, noticed Rogers waiting by the road on December 2nd, 1980, near midday, and made what turned out to be a fateful decision. Moved by compassion for the traveler, Hartshorn invited Rogers into his vehicle. While driving in an effort to be welcoming, Hartshorn handed Rogers a can of 7-Up to drink. This small gesture of kindness would inadvertently link Hartshorn, even if indirectly, to a triple murder. During the ride, Rogers said something that should have alerted Hartshorn and indicated that something was deeply wrong with this man's mind. Rogers told Hartshorn, "There are people launching rockets from Mount Olympus, and eventually one will strike my pyramid and destroy me." This statement offered a glimpse into the paranoid delusions controlling Rogers' thoughts, exposing the schizophrenic condition that had shattered his grip on reality. Hartshorn, perhaps uncertain how to respond to such a bizarre and disturbing comment, eventually dropped Rogers off at the Strode home, a dwelling in the isolated Nevada landscape. But the Strode family, David, Rudy, and Norma Strode, were living there, going about their daily routines, unaware that a man consumed by serious mental illness and paranoid delusions was about to arrive at their door. The events that followed would become one of Nevada's most savage triple murders. Moreover, the legal system's handling of this crime would serve as an example of how the judiciary failed to properly represent someone suffering from grave mental health issues. The exact sequence of events inside the Strode home on that December day isn't fully documented, but subsequent physical evidence and conditions painted a scene of immense brutality. The victims were repeatedly shot and stabbed, their bodies found beneath blankets in a bedroom. Signs of torture and cruelty were evident, with the corpses showing injuries from intense violence. Rogers' fingerprints were detected on several items in the residence, including the 7-Up can he had drunk from, and a glass bottle found in the bedroom under the blanket alongside the victims' bodies. This evidence tied him directly to the murder scene. After the triple killing, Rogers fled using the victim's car. He headed toward the Canadian border, behaving in ways that further revealed his acute psychological instability. Upon reaching the border, he attempted to enter Canada wearing a parka-style coat with what appeared to be a towel wrapped around his head or neck, creating a bizarre and alarming appearance. When questioned by Canadian border agents, Rogers declared himself the Emperor of North America. and stated he was requesting political asylum due to persecution by the CIA, biker gangs, the FBI, and unorganized crime. The officials, recognizing this man was seriously disturbed, denied him entry and placed him under arrest. Rogers was extradited back to Nevada and charged with capital murder related to the Strode family's killings. He faced the possibility of a death sentence if convicted, a sentence requiring both a jury's conviction and evidence of aggravating circumstances qualifying him for capital punishment. It was here that the first and perhaps most crucial breakdown in the legal process occurred. Mark Rogers was assigned a public defender named Virginia Chimes to represent him in this capital murder trial. By all accounts, Virginia Chimes was severely ill-equipped to handle a capital murder case, especially one with a defendant suffering from extreme mental illness and mounting an insanity defense. She had been newly licensed by the Nevada State Bar just 4 months before being assigned Rogers' case. She had no experience trying a capital case throughout her career. She had never argued an insanity defense before. She was working alone at an outpost office of the Nevada State Public Defender's Office and carried an overwhelming caseload of 80 cases simultaneously, including another capital case and another first-degree murder trial. The appellate court later described the circumstances with striking clarity. She faced insurmountable odds which inherently disadvantaged her client as well. Despite the immense challenges she faced, Chimes did attempt to present an insanity defense on behalf of Rogers. She called expert witnesses who testified that Rogers was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia when the killings occurred. These specialists stated that his behavior during the crimes was consistent with psychotic paranoid delusions, schizophrenia, and psychosis. They expressed the view that Rogers was incapable of distinguishing right from wrong and didn't understand the nature and consequences of his actions. The medical and psychological evidence supported the claim that Rogers was legally insane at the time he committed the murders. But despite this evidence, despite the clear signs of serious mental illness, and despite the testimony from multiple experts, the jury found Rogers guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. They rejected the insanity defense and declared him responsible. The guilty verdict alone would have resulted in a lengthy incarceration, but the legal proceedings continued. The state sought to impose the harshest punishment, execution. During the penalty phase of the trial, where the jury was to decide if Rogers should face death or life in prison, the prosecution worked to establish aggravating circumstances that would justify a death sentence. Rogers offered no witnesses and introduced no evidence in the penalty phase, relying solely on the mental health information that had been provided during the trial's guilt phase. This was a strategic decision, but whether it stemmed from Chimes' inexperience or another reason remains uncertain. The jury eventually identified 2 aggravating factors. First, that the murders were carried out by someone with a prior conviction for a felony involving violence or its threat. And second, that the killings involved torture, depravity of mind, or mutilation of the victim. They determined there were no mitigating factors strong enough to outweigh these aggravators. Based on this, they sentenced him to death. Mark Rogers was sent to death row in Nevada, where he would spend the coming decades fighting for his life through the appellate process. The first appellate challenge to Rogers' conviction and death sentence was reviewed by the Nevada Supreme Court. Rogers argued that the aggravating circumstance related to torture, depravity of mind, and mutilation was unconstitutionally vague. The Nevada Supreme Court dismissed this claim, ruling that the jury instruction was clear enough and that the evidence supported the finding of aggravators. After this initial appeal concluded, Rogers proceeded into the federal appellate system. For many years, Rogers remained on death row as his case progressed slowly through the federal courts. But in 2015, over 34 years after his conviction, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit considered his habeas corpus petition challenging his death sentence. The appellate panel focused on a crucial matter: whether Rogers had been provided sufficient legal representation in his capital murder trial. The Ninth Circuit's assessment was harsh. The court determined that Chimes, though she had done her best under unmanageable conditions, was simply not qualified to handle a capital case, especially one involving an insanity defense and a mentally ill defendant. The court noted that Chimes' inexperience, her overwhelming caseload, and the lack of support she received resulted in a situation where Rogers' death sentence was issued in violation of his Sixth Amendment right to competent counsel. The panel observed that she faced overwhelming odds and, implicitly, so did her mentally ill client. The Ninth Circuit upheld the district court's granting of habeas corpus relief, vacating Rogers' death sentence and ordering a new penalty phase hearing. The court's ruling didn't proclaim innocence. Rogers remained convicted of the murders. Rather, it acknowledged that the way his death sentence had been delivered violated constitutional standards for fair legal procedure. The Mark Rogers case represents one of the most important critiques of capital punishment in modern times, not because of uncertainty about his guilt — the fingerprint and physical evidence were compelling — but because it demonstrates how the criminal justice system can fail to protect even those defendants who appear least deserving of sympathy's rights and protection. Rogers had committed horrific crimes, driven by paranoid delusions and distorted thinking from severe mental illness. By any rational standard, he posed a danger to society. But what appellate courts examined wasn't whether he was guilty or dangerous. It concerned whether he'd received a fair trial and sentencing procedure, and according to the Ninth Circuit's conclusion, he hadn't. Assigning him an inexperienced, overloaded attorney in a capital case stripped him of the representation guaranteed by the Constitution. The case also raised broader questions about severe mental illness intersecting with the death penalty. Rogers clearly had mental illness when committing the murders, evidenced through his paranoid delusions about pyramids and rockets, later proclaiming himself Emperor of North America, and psychiatric experts' testimony. The justice system has long struggled with whether imposing the death penalty on individuals suffering from severe mental illness violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court has determined that those with intellectual disabilities are particularly vulnerable to wrongful execution. However, the legal framework surrounding mental illness is more complex. A person can be convicted even with a mental illness if they understood the nature and consequences of their actions and recognized that these actions were wrong. Even by the legal standards at the time of Rogers' trial, it was theoretically possible to execute someone with a mental disorder. But the ethical question persists over whether this should happen, whether capital punishment is a just response for someone whose crimes were driven by profound psychiatric delusions. The case of Mark Rogers illustrates a convergence of multiple failures within the criminal justice system. First, there was a failure to provide adequate mental health care and intervention before the crimes, allowing Rogers to deteriorate into such a severe state of mental illness that he committed a triple murder. Second, there was a failure to ensure competent legal defense during the capital trial, assigning an inexperienced lawyer to represent a mentally ill man in a situation where his life depended on the quality of that representation. Third, there was a failure to properly evaluate mental illness as a mitigating factor in the sentence stage, where the jury identified no circumstances to lessen the severity, despite clear proof of Rogers' serious psychiatric condition. The Ninth Circuit's decision to overturn Rogers' death sentence and mandate a new penalty phase hearing didn't amount to a full acquittal or an assertion that Rogers should be released. It acknowledged the necessity for a fresh proceeding, one in which Rogers would receive better legal counsel and his mental health issues could be more thoroughly examined. Nevertheless, this case serves as a powerful condemnation of how capital punishment can be applied unjustly, even when the defendant's guilt is unquestionable. The victims, David, Rudy, and Norma Strode, were real people brutally killed by someone afflicted with severe mental illness. Their deaths were genuine tragedies, and their families endured real suffering. Neither the appellate processes nor the affirmation of Mark Rogers' constitutional rights lessons that tragedy or suffering, but the question of how society ought to address a mentally ill person who commits murder, whether execution is fair, whether the legal proceedings were just, whether constitutional protections were upheld, remains one that courts and society continue to wrestle with. Mark Rogers remains incarcerated for the murders of the Strode family, serving a lengthy prison term for crimes committed, while under the influence of paranoid delusions that left him unable to distinguish reality from the terrifying fantasies in his mind. Whether he will ever face execution or whether a new penalty phase hearing will lead to another death sentence or life imprisonment remains undecided. But his case will persist as a reference point and example for how the criminal justice system must improve in ensuring fair administration of capital punishment, adequate consideration of mental illness, and provision of constitutional legal representation for defendants, even those who are guilty and have committed terrible acts.